sure to be copyright free. I hope it is. I'm just gonna start the video with this, and then you know the rest. But I'm not gonna like always do these style videos because it's technically like stealing content. So I try to like add this stuff to it and not just be quiet and like not add sound anyways, as you could probably guess. So that's why I try to choose like old videos from like specific channels. But anyway. Hopefully you could hear me. I don't have like a microphone either.
Many years ago now, I used to work up in Alaska as a member of the Park Services. One day we had gotten a call about some illegal dumping on one of the local trails, so myself and another employee went out to check it out. We were fairly deep into the trails, not too many people around except for a few joggers, when we came around to turn on the path. As we were walking, my partner looked into the woods and said, "What in the world? There's a guy there." About 20 yards away, there was a white guy with longish hair crouched behind a bush, just kind of staring at us. The man noticed that we had noticed him, and he immediately stood up and stretched out his arms in the air, like he was just enjoying the day. He actually approached us, and it turns out the man that I was with actually knew the man in the woods. He was a local builder or owned a construction company. In fact, he had built a deck for my friend a year prior. After they said their hellos, he mentioned that he just stepped off the path for a moment to take a leak. It was kind of strange though, because we had seen him, and that definitely wasn't what he was doing. But he wasn't that suspicious, and my friend knew him, so after making sure that he wasn't illegally dumping or anything of that nature, we just started walking back, and he walked with us for a fair while. A few years later, I heard that the man that we had seen had been arrested. Apparently, there had been some sort of altercation with a girl at a coffee shop, or so I had initially been told, and he had shot her in a robbery and was under arrest for murder. The truth was even more bizarre. The man, Israel Keys, was a serial killer who had actually abducted, tortured, and murdered the girl. After being arrested, it turns out that he had been traveling around the country murdering people randomly for years. He would bury murder kits and come back sometimes years later to dig them up, and they would include guns, cash, etc., and whatever he needed. I went back later to where we had come across Israel in the woods to see if there was any such a kit buried there, but I didn't find anything. Others suggested that he might have been waiting to surprise a victim on the trail, but that didn't seem to be his general MO, as was my understanding. Anyway, our encounter is something that I never have totally been able to explain, and since he ended up taking his own life before trial, I likely never will. I've worked as a park ranger for the National Park Service for coming up on 10 years now, and this is the most frightening thing that's ever happened to me. I was driving on a dirt road, and just a regular patrol day, when I saw a plume of smoke ahead of me. I thought that I might have to call in a fire or something, but when I rounded a bend, I was greeted with the sight of a van parked in the middle of the track, completely engulfed in flames. The tires were melted, things were popped. And exploding inside, and it was this raging inferno. I thought someone had just ditched a car and lit it up, so I didn't think much of it at first, and called 911 and reported it. Then had to drive like a half hour extra to get around it. I find out later that it wasn't abandoned. There had been a guy in the driver's seat. He had to be long dead by the time I showed up, so I don't regret not checking it out further. It wasn't an accident, though, so the car was parked in the middle of the road and it hadn't hit anything. It was eventually ruled that he had actually taken his own life, but I really can't imagine how anyone would choose to go that way. It was also a super weird place, not out of the way or right by his house. Now, I think about it a lot because it just doesn't seem to make any sense to me outside of some catastrophic engine failure. As weird as it sounds to some, my first job out of college was working for the National Park Service as a ranger in training. I was based in NorCal at the time, and the survey protocol we were working had us out on ATVs just after sunset, stopping periodically to mimic owl hoots before listening for their response. One night I was riding my ATV on a logging road that was right along a river. I saw a blur off to the side, and before I knew it, there was a smallish black bear running 5 feet ahead of my ATV. I immediately slowed down to avoid hitting it, but since it was so small, I thought its mother might still be around, so I was half expecting a mama bear claw on my back. The bear ran ahead of me on the road for probably 5 seconds. It felt like much longer, before disappearing into the forest on the other side. As soon as the road was clear, I pounded the throttle on the ATV and got out of there. In retrospect, the bear was probably a yearling, and no longer with its mother. But in the heat of the moment, it was a terrifying possibility.
Hey guys, by the way, I got a 256 gigabyte SD, so I can record for at least 10 hours. And I have 2 backup batteries, which my videos are already long enough as they are, I guess. I don't know. Depending on who's watching, and like if you want to like see the area, if you're from like another country, and you might like the long videos. But either way, hopefully the quality's a lot better.
Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. Were Texan by birth, and at the outbreak of World War II, they returned their family to the Lone Star State to settle in a 2-bedroom house in Fort Worth. The first of 6 children, Paul was a precocious child and showed a talent for gardening that pleasantly surprised his parents. He also showed an affinity with animals and once tamed a crow that became his constant but mischievous companion. Paul pushed back against his disciplinarian father and carried a disdain for authority into his early adulthood. He refused to sign a loyalty oath in college and actively protested against the Vietnam War. Paul went his own way, for better or worse. During the summer of 1962, a friend of Paul's sister visited the Fugate home, intent on swapping some dance tips with the girls. Dottie and the Fugate sisters knew each other through the Girl Scouts, but upon entering her friend's home that day, Dottie ran into a young man with a crew cut and Buddy Holly glasses. Dottie was only vaguely familiar with Paul, but found herself riveted by an unexpected lesson on Inuit culture, which he delivered with a kind of nerdy panache. It was then that Paul asked Dottie if she'd like to see his gun. This might be a massive red flag for many young women, but it was a calculated move on Paul's part. And Dottie was on the women's shooting team at what was then Arlington State College and was a passionate firearms enthusiast. No ideas for dance moves were swapped that day, and Paul's sisters were furious that he had hijacked their friend's visit. But neither Paul nor Dottie cared, as each felt the butterflies of a budding romance. Paul's romance with Dottie was just about the only thing he cared about. He worked a variety of odd jobs while studying for a degree that, by his own admission, he didn't really care for. Yet apathy was somewhat ironic, given the fact that Paul was one of the most talented students the university had ever seen. After studying at his university's botany department, one of his supervising professors called him one of the finest students he'd ever worked with, adding that Paul was easily in the top 10 students of the past 3 decades. Paul's reputation among his peers was so great that, following his disappearance, a classmate named a new plant species in his honor, a flowering desert perennial called Amzonia fugatii. Following his graduation, education, he briefly considered using his degree to secure a well-paid job at Utah's Dugway Proving Ground, but at the moment of truth, he changed his mind. Paul wanted freedom, independence, and the loving embrace of Mother Nature, and with that in mind, he applied for the National Park Service instead. Following Paul and Dottie's wedding in December of 1964, Paul went to work at the Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. After New Mexico, the Fugates were stationed at the sandstone canyons of Arizona's Navajo National Monument, home of the Batatacan cliff dwelling. It was the kind of lifestyle Paul had always dreamed of, but it was far from perfect. Paul's superiors were everything he loathed, and they once chastised him for his anti-authority streak, his laziness, and his personal appearance. If you want to look and live like a hippie, that is certainly your prerogative, but not here at Navajo National Monument, one wrote, furious that he couldn't just fire the man. Instead, in 1970, the Park Service transferred Paul to another national park instead, the Chiricahuas National Monument, where he and Dottie would spend the next 10 years of their lives in relative bliss. Then, on Sunday, January 13th of 1980, Paul stepped out of the Chiricahua Visitor Center, wearing his standard Park Service uniform and red-winged boots, and carrying a green down parka. I'm going to do a trail, he announced to a coworker, adding that if he wasn't back by 4:30, she should close up without him. Little did this coworker know, it was the last time anyone would see Paul again. By 8 p.m., the same worried coworker contacted the park superintendent, who in turn joined his subordinates in searching the surrounding area. The rangers covered a lot of ground, calling out Paul's name all the while, but eerily, there were no signs of him anywhere. The following morning, the park superintendent contacted the Cochise County Sheriff's Office to officially report Paul missing. Law enforcement then organized an intensive search and rescue effort consisting of almost 30 rangers and police officers, with the team soon joined by a National Guard helicopter and 16 volunteers from the Southern Arizona Rescue Association. The official search effort lasted just over 2 weeks, but Dottie organized volunteer search groups for months, then eventually years afterwards. They walked the trails, checked abandoned mines, held benefit concerts, and badgered local politicians, but sadly, their efforts have so far never borne fruit, and the only real theory is a grim one. A criminal investigator for the sheriff's department had reported that Paul may have been the victim of a drug deal gone wrong. Since Cochise County shares 80 miles of border with Mexico, the area is well traveled by drug smugglers and human traffickers, and it was suggested that a chance encounter with such criminals might have ended very, very badly for the gregarious Paul. Yet without any solid evidence of such an attack or abduction, all anyone could do is wait, wonder, and hope. Paul remains the only Park Service ranger ever to go missing and never be accounted for, and over the years, his unsolved disappearance has haunted everyone it's touched. A retired detective who once worked the case officially now investigates Paul's disappearance on his own time, traveling around the state and re-interviewing sources. And in 2018, the reward for information was raised from $20,000 to $60,000. At one point, a heartbroken but resolute Dottie brought in a psychic who immediately detected what she called a time portal inside a home Paul used to frequent. This psychic also claimed that she'd had a vision of two men bending over a woman's drugged, unconscious body. Paul was in the vision, witnessing something he shouldn't, and after apprehending him, the two men shoved a drug down his throat and dumped him across the Mexican border. Dottie seemed shaken by the psychic's so-called vision, not because she was a believer in the supernatural, but because it was a disturbingly familiar story. In 2014, a Park Service employee named Karen Gonzalez was assaulted and nearly killed by an alleged drug smuggler from Mexico. The incident happened within spitting distance of where Paul was last seen, meaning the murder was perhaps Dottie's single biggest clue as to the fate of her husband. Yet Dottie has long feared that her husband had suffered some kind of violent death. Just 5 days after he went missing, Dick Horton, a Park Service volunteer in his 50s, came forward with a crucial piece of information, one which would set the tone of the investigation for years to come. Around the time of Paul's disappearance, Dick had been out driving with his wife when he'd spotted Paul slumped between two men in a pickup truck, which seemed to be rapidly fleeing the area. One police officer found Dick's story so compelling that he asked him to undergo deep hypnosis in order to recall minute details of what he witnessed. Dick recalled the pickup was a dark green color with a camper shell. The driver was in his 30s, had a trimmed beard, and was wearing a black and red flannel shirt. The second man wore a green jacket, one eerily similar to the one Paul wore as part of his ranger uniform. According to Dick, Paul himself looked sad and dejected and appeared to be nursing some kind of minor head injury. If what Dick had witnessed was Paul's abduction by drug traffickers or people smugglers, his hesitancy to come forward meant that any guilty parties would essentially have an entire week's head start. However, the fact remains that aside from one solitary witness statement, there is no solid evidence to place Paul in anyone's truck that day. In the words, and that's not a lot right now. All we know is that Paul's missing, but there's no evidence to tell us anything else. By the summer of 1980, the swirl of rumor and speculation had condensed into two basic theories. The first was mostly propagated by a Park Service investigator named Pat Hanby, who believed that Paul had simply walked out on his career and marriage and that his disappearance was voluntary. He cited what he referred to as Paul's flagging career prospects, as well as something much seedier than the investigation had shed light on. After more than a decade of marriage, Paul had started an affair with a 19-year-old colleague, one that had resulted in an unexpected pregnancy. The young lady was forced to seek an abortion, so there was no reason for Paul to flee child support payments and the like, but it's possible that the shame and heartache drove him to seek a new life elsewhere. However, one missing persons detective was vocal in his belief that some kind of foul play has caused Paul's disappearance. Criminal investigator Craig Emanuel insisted that following extensive interviews with Paul's wife, the affair and his career prospects were irrelevant. Paul was content with his life, and he would never have just walked out on Dottie unless he was under duress. Emanuel also placed a lot of credence in the witness statement of Dick Horton and suggested that Dick may have witnessed Paul being disappeared by the foot soldiers of some kind of smuggling ring. Emanuel also pointed out that in the months following Paul's disappearance, he had received an anonymous block print letter telling him to ask Ernest Goff in the county jail in Phoenix about Mr. Fugate. The following year, another letter in the same style claimed that a man by the name of Tex Carpenter had been involved in Paul's murder. Carpenter initially agreed to take a polygraph test in October of 1981, but changed his mind during the pre-test interview after 3 hours of discordant hectoring. During this rant, Carpenter swore that he'd seen two men shoot Paul, and had even helped bury him in a dry gulch just south of Tucson. However, just 2 weeks later, Carpenter denied having said any of the sort, and apparently under pressure from his prison's chapter of the Aryan Brotherhood, Carpenter later said that he might know something about Paul's disappearance, but wouldn't talk unless he got some kind of deal. Ernest Goff, on the other hand, denied any involvement whatsoever and refused to answer any questions unless formally charged with a crime. Both men have since died, meaning any such leads might well have gone to their graves with them. Some have even suggested that Dottie herself was involved in her husband's disappearance, with many theories based around a rather untimely inquiry. Just 2 weeks after Paul vanished, Dottie asked how long she would have to wait before getting Paul's retirement benefits. She was told the inquiry was a little premature, as the authorities were still hopeful that Paul would be found alive. Dottie replied that she was simply preparing for the worst. I wasn't making much money when I asked about his retirement benefits, Dottie later said. It was just one of those things you do. The inquiry apparently led to her being asked to undergo a polygraph test, and although it was implied to be a fairly informal and friendly interview, Dottie showed up with a lawyer, a close friend, and a tape recorder. Despite her somewhat suspicious behavior, the police examiner felt that Dottie was being truthful in her claim that she was innocent of any involvement. Yet the result didn't explain a number of other curious details which investigators found interesting. At Paul's cabin, investigators found an unfinished life insurance application and a check Dottie had written to Paul from their joint bank account. This had been used to suggest that Dottie and Paul were about to attempt some kind of life insurance scam. But even if this wasn't the case, a few pieces of correspondence seemed to suggest Paul knew that his life was in danger. In one of Dottie's file boxes, police found a letter that Paul had written to her, along with a handwritten will. It was dated December 23rd, 1978, just over a year before he went missing. You won't be opening this unless something bad has happened, or at least I hope not. It began. I have done what I could to see that you can be self-sufficient and believe that is possible now. I know that I've been a long way from perfect and all, and seem to have got worse as time has passed, but still, I love you dearly. Paul left specific advice on selling some of his rifles and giving him a cheap burial. He also emphasized that the best strategy for her to claim his government death benefits, before adding that she had the proper talents to succeed without him. Some have interpreted this as evidence of collusion and insist that Dottie is well aware of Paul's secretive but continued existence. Dottie, on the other hand, has stated that if Paul really was alive, there's no way she'd be able to live apart from him. Nor would she be able to hide her joy or fake such a deep, long-lasting grief. Since the disappearance of her husband, Dottie Fugate has never been romantically involved with another man, and her best friend in the world is none other than Paul's young sister. Paul remains the only National Park Ranger in U.S. history to be the victim of an unexplained disappearance, but maybe that's because he doesn't want to be found. Yet in all likelihood, Paul's fate remains a mystery to this day because someone else didn't want him found. After all, dead men tell no tales. I work as a park ranger here in New Mexico, and a few years back, we were dealing with a particularly vicious outbreak of wildfires. We were working with this group of wildland firefighters, coordinating and supplying the various teams in our non-stop, no-sleep fight to put the fires out. On the incident maps, it's common to make notations of areas that are considered sensitive. This can range from areas with suspected and known endangered species, known pot farms, and Native American land with cultural significance. So, we were late into our shift. Can't even recall what day we were on because typically assignments can last up to 14 to 28 days depending on our need for resources. We were working with a Native American crew because our division went through culturally sensitive land. Everything was going good. Darkness fell, and it was coming up on break time eventually. We were all dead tired, sucking in smoke all day, little sleep. It was pretty normal, actually. Fire was pretty much out in our area, minus a few hot spots that just needed mopping up. As I was sitting against a tree, all of our normal radio traffic turned to nothing but static, which is totally common in areas that are out there. Fighting the urge to sleep, I got one of those moments that just wakes you up. Like when you wake up from a dream where you're falling. It was like that. But there were these figures, similar to the ghost of Obi-Wan. It was like they would walk behind a tree and disappear. Nobody else saw it, but I've heard similar stories before. I'm not a person who really believes in ghosts or paranormal stuff. I feel like it was real, but I do my best to believe that it was just hallucinations from lack of sleep. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you've got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilation.
Buddhists believe that human life is a constant cycle of birth, suffering, and then death. And then you're reborn, you suffer again, you die again, over and over and over again, forever, unless you're able to achieve enlightenment, or nirvana, as it's called. However, no one really knows what nirvana actually is, what it looks like, what it feels like, where it is. Buddhists will say that the only way to actually understand nirvana is to experience it yourself. It's kind of like trying to describe to someone what chocolate tastes like. You can use any number of superlatives to describe the flavor, but until that person bites a piece of chocolate, they won't really fully understand it. And so, the goal of all Buddhists is to try to attain nirvana. And every day, hundreds of millions of Buddhists all around the world try very hard to do just that. But within Buddhism, there is a small subset of practitioners who have effectively dedicated their entire existence to attaining nirvana. And these people are the famous Buddhist monks. It is extremely difficult to become a Buddhist monk because the sacrifice is enormous. You have to leave your family, your friends, society, all your possessions, your name, your status, everything, and go live in a monastery, which is a kind of isolated place where monks live. And there you will spend your life living this very simple, very strict religious life where basically all you do is try to attain nirvana. As a result of this extreme lifestyle that Buddhist monks live, they have developed a reputation for being some of the most disciplined people on the planet. But even by Buddhist monk standards, their sacred ritual of Sokushin Butsu takes discipline to a whole nother level. Last week, our company decided that we needed to hire a graphic designer, and so I got tasked with finding candidates. Fine, and they look user-friendly, makes it easy. Created over 1,000 years ago up in the rugged mountains of northern Japan by a sect of Buddhists called the Shingon. And the Shingon believed that you could attain nirvana through physical punishment. And out of that idea was born the incredibly brutal Sokushin Butsu ritual. In short, Buddhist monks can choose to participate in this ritual, and if they successfully complete it, they might attain nirvana. But they won't know until the ritual is over. Meaning, it's kind of like a big gamble. Put yourself through absolute hell, and maybe you have this huge payoff, but maybe not. However, trying to attain nirvana through other means was really difficult. There was no other really clear pathways to nirvana, and so having this one distinct pathway, no matter how difficult it was really appealing. And so since its creation, hundreds and hundreds of Buddhist monks have tried it, and maybe less than 100 have actually successfully completed it, and then of that 100 or less, only 24 have actually attained nirvana through this process. The instructions for Sokushin Butsu are actually quite simple. There are 3 phases. Phase 1 is called Moku Jikagayo, which roughly means tree eating training, and it's primarily focused on the monk's diet. It takes 1,000 days to complete this phase. However, most monks go much longer than 1,000 days. During this phase, monks will only eat byproducts of trees, things like seeds, nuts, tree bark, tree roots, pine needles, and they will collect all this food on their own. It should be noted, though, that some monks in this first phase will ingest small rocks. This is likely done because they are starving and they can't find food, and by eating the rocks take up space in their stomach and kind of curb their appetite a little bit. But because they don't actually digest the rocks, they're not technically breaking the phase 1 diet restrictions, and so they can continue on with this ritual. Additionally, during this first phase, the monks adhere to a very involved and strenuous physical exercise routine, and then whenever they're not foraging for food or exercising, they are meditating. At the end of the 1,000th day of phase 1, if the monk has survived, because sometimes phase 1 monks do die mostly from starvation, it is up to them if they are ready to move on to phase 2. This decision ultimately comes down to whether or not, 1, the monk actually adhered to the strict rules of phase 1, something really only that monk would know, and then 2, whether or not the monk actually believes they are spiritually ready to move on to phase 2. Phase 2 is much shorter than phase 1, but it is significantly more challenging. And so the monks going into phase 2, they really need to kind of bring their A game and have no second thoughts. They need to be fully committed to phase 2 in order to successfully complete it. For reference, most of the 24 monks who successfully attained nirvana through this ritual repeated phase 1, 2, or even 3 times just to make sure they really were ready. Phase 2 is called dojo, and it roughly translates to deep meditation. But a better way to think about what this phase entails is these monks need to enter into a sort of trance-like state, almost like an out-of-body experience, because what they're going to go through in this phase is so physically uncomfortable that unless you're able to kind of detach mentally, there's just no way to go through with it. And so during the second phase, the monks will sit down and meditate basically constantly for 100 straight days. And during that time, they don't eat any more tree byproducts or rocks. Instead, they have a liquid diet. They drink a little bit of salt water, and they drink a lot of a very particular kind of tea. The tea is made from Toxicodendron verniculum tree bark, which contains the same toxin in poison ivy. Meaning, for phase 2, you basically just sit alone by yourself for 100 days while simultaneously drinking a poisonous tea that causes a massive allergic reaction inside of your throat and stomach that causes an intense itching sensation inside of you that you cannot physically itch. Also, this poisonous tea gives you explosive diarrhea and it makes you vomit a lot. If you somehow manage to survive all 100 days of phase 2, and unfortunately many monks don't, you automatically move on to phase 3. Unlike phase 1, phase 2 never gets repeated, most likely because it almost certainly would be fatal to do so. Phase 3 is either the easiest or the hardest part of the Sokushinbitsu ritual, depending on how you look at it. It doesn't have a name like the other 2 phases, perhaps because so few people make it to this part of the ritual, but regardless, phase 3 definitely has a strict set of rules like the other 2 phases. The phase 3 monk has a small pine box that has no windows built just for them. It needs to be big enough that they can sit inside of it in the lotus pose, which is how they typically sit when they're meditating. And then once it's all built, the monk climbs into this box. They put a lid over the top of it, but they put a bamboo shoot, like a bamboo pole, through the cover of this box, so there is a breathing tube for this monk inside of this box. And then they lower the monk inside of the small pine box 10 feet into this hole in the ground, and then once they ensure the bamboo pole is going to be above ground so they can breathe, they fill the hole in with charcoal. Before we cover what happens next in phase 3, you need some context about what this ritual is actually doing to the monks performing it. Phase 1, tree eating training, serves 2 purposes. The first is it's kind of like a big gut check. It really shows who wants to do this ritual and who doesn't. It's kind of like if you can't complete phase 1, you certainly can't complete phase 2 or phase 3. So it's like a filter, it weeds out the weak monks. The second purpose of phase 1 is to literally shrink the monk. The tree-eating diet, combined with the constant physical exercise, removes all of their body fat and a lot of their muscle, and so they're incredibly lean by the end of phase 1. And this will be significant when we talk about the end of phase 3. Phase 2, deep meditation phase, serves 2 purposes as well. The first purpose is that it puts the monk into that trance-like state, and then the second purpose it serves is the toxin inside of this poisonous tea kills off all of the naturally occurring bacteria and parasites inside of the monk. Again, that will become significant when we get to the end of phase 3. Speaking of which, so in phase 3, the monk is put in their box, they're lowered 10 feet into the ground, the breathing bamboo shoot is installed, the charcoal is dumped on top of them, and then for several days, the third phase monk will sit in total darkness and meditate constantly, and each day, they have a bell down there with them, they ring the bell. That's the only thing they have to do besides meditate. And above ground, there is a team of monks that are supporting this ritual, and they're listening for that bell. And the first day they don't hear the bell, it means the monk in the box has completed the ritual, and now it is time to see if they have attained nirvana. In Buddhism, someone whose body does not decay, aka a mummy, is someone who has cheated death. And to cheat death, suffering death, repeat. meaning becoming a mummy is a way to attain nirvana. And Sokushinbutsu is a self-mummification ritual. Phase 1 shrinks the monk's body, it removes their fat and muscle, it also removes a lot of moisture inside of their body, and their diet also withholds nutrients to all of the bacteria and parasites that naturally occur inside of their bodies. And so those bacteria and parasites that normally would play a big role in helping decompose your body after death begin to die off. And so the cumulative effect of phase 1 on these monks is that if they were to die at the end of phase 1, their decomposition would be drastically slowed. It wouldn't be mummy status, but it would be close. The phase 2 poisonous tea, that toxin that they're drinking, that kills off the remainder of the bacteria and parasites that did not die during phase 1. Also, all the vomiting and diarrhea completely dehydrates them, which aids in slowing down decomposition after death. Finally, phase 3 is the death phase. The monk goes into their tomb, they're buried underground, and they ring that bell each day to tell the people on the ground that they are still alive. And then when the bell stops ringing, it means the monk in the box is dead. At which point the crew on the ground removes the bamboo breathing pole and then lets the body sit in the box underground for another 1,000 days. And then after 1,000 days, they pull the box up, they lift the lid off, and if there is little to no signs of decay on their body, it means the self-mummification ritual worked, they're a mummy, they've attained nirvana, and now their body is holy. And so they're brought out of the box, they're dressed in robes, they're placed in the monasteries, and they are worshipped. As for the unlucky monks who get to the end of Sokushinbutsu, but are found to be decomposing inside of their box when they're brought back up again, they're just placed back inside of their pine box and buried, and they are not worshipped. Sokushinbutsu was made illegal in Japan in the late 19th century, but we know monks continued to practice it into the 20th century, and in theory, today, monks still like practice it in secret. We have a podcast called the Mr. Ballin Podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive stories on
me who disclose the information to the public. This will be the last post involving this personal story of mine, because I've already been hearing rumors at work about somebody who's leaking private information involving a case, but I'm not sure if they think it's me or someone else. The best thing for me to do is to end it here and lay low for a while, but I hope the chief from my department is not reading scary stories posted on the internet, so he won't find this. With that out of the way, I must tell you how everything went down those last fatal days when my partner and I were still working on the case. With the days passing by, and no strong evidence showing what truly happened to this man being brought to the table, this case was going to become cold and even given up on, and he would just be another missing person ad in the newspaper. At the time, I was sick of dealing with this case, mainly because, after we first went into this man's trailer, I looked into his journal. There had been strange occurrences and sensations that I felt randomly. Some chilled me to the back of my spine. This whole case was going down a rabbit hole, leading everywhere but nowhere, all at once. We also had a cleanup crew go through and take down the shrine of the missing people's faces. They threw away the stuff in the trees and scattered the rocks formed into a circle, leaving the area in its original state. While they were doing this cleanup, there were reports of hearing voices mumbling to them, but so quietly they couldn't understand what was being said. However, there was one thing that every single one of them heard clear as day, and it was someone who was whistling in a raspy, uneven tone. It started with one of them supposedly saying something like, "Hey, if you can't whistle right, then shut up." Everyone was thinking one of them was doing it, but during their lunch break, when everyone had food in their mouths, they heard it again. That's when they decided to cut their lunch break and clean the rest of the area up, because all of them felt uneasy being there. It was after hearing those accounts that the light bulb clicked in my head. The family we questioned when the man first went missing told me that he had an annoying whistle, but the hairs on my neck stood up when I remembered hearing the faint whistle when we were walking back to our vehicle after searching his trailer. This guy must have been playing tricks on us for his own amusement, and probably enjoyed seeing us get all turned around while trying to figure out what happened to him. I told Daniel my story, and he was skeptical at first, but soon understood where I was coming from with my argument. We told the chief, and he told us to investigate one last time during the night and watch the missing person's campsite to see if he's not sneaking back in the middle of the night. The deal was that if we found him, the case would be dismissed, but if we didn't see anything, the case would become cold and all investigation involving it would be terminated. We agreed and drove back to the woods to stay the night, patrolling the area. It was a night that would scar me for the rest of my life. While we were patrolling the area before the sun fully hid behind the mountains, we talked to a few of the campers staying on the campground, and they seemed distressed. We asked them what was wrong, and they said they kept hearing some whistling, but couldn't figure out where it was coming from. Even when they walked down to the lake, it seemed to follow them, and because of this, they planned to cut their vacation short and get out of here. It probably made them feel more paranoid after hearing about someone go missing here in the past week, especially when they were constantly seeing officers from search and rescue. I responded saying, if I were in your shoes, then that would be exactly what I would do too. We talked a little longer, but Daniel insisted that we needed to keep a better eye out for the man, just in case he returned. I understood, and we drove to where we could see the man's camp trailer, but we're still well hidden. That's when the waiting begun until midnight. The full moon illuminated the ground, causing our visibility of the man's trailer to still work out without the need for a flashlight. As we were sitting there, we noticed a few pine cones falling from the trees nearby and bouncing off the ground below. You think that's either a squirrel or a chipmunk knocking those down? I asked while stretching and letting out a yawn. It could be. I've seen chipmunks knock them down quite often. Daniel responded as we gazed at where they were dropping. That's when we heard something snap and saw a large branch fall from the same tree the pine cones were coming from. That has to be a bear cub or something to break a branch that big, I stated, wondering what was up there. If that's the case, then we have to get it out of the campground so it won't hurt anyone, Daniel said as he opened his side door and grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight, big enough to be considered as a weapon, and shined it at the tree. I couldn't see exactly where he was shining because I was still in the vehicle, but Daniel pulled out his weapon and started screaming, "Sir, get out of the tree now!" I wondered what was going on, so I got out and saw where Daniel steadily held his flashlight. How did he get up there? The words fell out of my mouth as we watched the man we were looking for at the top of the tree, clinging to the base. He didn't move at all, but his eyes were illuminated by the flashlight and reflected bright red. "Sir, I won't tell you again. Climb down from the tree, or if you're incapable of doing so, please let us know," Daniel yelled with droplets of spit falling out. The man didn't respond, but just stayed put, watching us intensely with those glaring eyes. Suddenly, the man jumps from one tree to another, and that's when we notice that all he's wearing is some tattered, dirty blue jeans. Daniel opened fire trying to get him down, but the man was so swift with his movements that Daniel wasn't able to land a shot. "Let's follow him," Daniel screamed as he ran after the man. I followed closely behind with my weapon drawn, wondering what was wrong with the man. Briefly, we could see him jumping from tree to tree, and we continued after him slowly, going deeper into the woods. "Where did he go?" I said while breathing in gulps of air. "I don't know. You hear that?" Daniel asked as he glanced about. Listening closely, I could hear the faint sound of someone whistling. "He's got to be close by," Daniel stated firmly while tightening his grip on his weapon. Closely listening to the raspy, uneven whistling, I said, "It's getting louder. That must mean he's..." Out of nowhere, the man pounced from one of the trees on top of me. He was trying to bite me, but I held him back the best I could, but his strength seemed inhuman. Daniel quickly shot the side of him, which caused him to dart off into the woods, and he was hunched over, grabbing his wound, just running as if nothing happened. "You okay?" Daniel quickly asked as he helped me to my feet and said, "Hurry, we can't lose him." I agreed, and we followed his bare footprints in the dirt that led to an open field covered in dry yellow grass. In the middle of the pasture, we noticed a dark spot. Shining our lights at it, it was the back of the man. Slowly but swiftly, we made our way over to him. But when we got there, we saw that he was shaking, and I asked sternly, "Sir, Please restrain yourself. We aren't trying to hurt you. The man's eyes darted at me, and he muttered, "Run. That thing left me to rot and is in search for a new host. Get out of here while you still can. We need to get you out of here. We're not leaving. Now please explain why you tried to attack us," Daniel asked sternly, not knowing everything that I knew about this man's dark past at this point. The man's eyes, who were staring me down slowly, started to move and stare at something just past me. Not looking behind me, I grabbed Daniel's arm and quickly yanked him towards where we came from. He restrained and pulled his arm from my grasp, saying, "What are you doing? We can't just leave him here." Not knowing what to do, I looked back at Daniel and saw a dark figure standing about 5 feet behind him. "There's something right behind you," I screamed, trying to pull my weapon that seemed stuck in its holster. Daniel then said, turning around, "What do you mean there's something?" As he looked behind him, the figure stayed still. Daniel drew his weapon and looked back at me, and I could sense fear in his eyes. The man on the ground began muttering nonsense words, which seemed to anger this thing, which suddenly disappeared. That's when the man on the ground started to kick his feet and scream. Daniel looked at me, and somehow read each other's mind, as we both darted back to the vehicle, leaving the man there. As we ran, we heard the screaming stop, but not waiting for anything, we jumped into the car and drove back into town. We got on the radio and reported back to the station on everything that went down, and they seemed in disbelief. As we got back into the station, there were people I had never seen there before, dressed in dark suits, that interviewed us on what exactly happened. And once it was over, they made us promise not to tell anyone else about it. After posting this, I guess I just broke that promise, but it is what it is. Later, I found out they closed the campground down, saying that it needed to be refurbished, and soon after there was a mysterious fire that swept the area, burning everything into ashes. In the newspaper, it was blamed on a butt of a cigarette that was tossed into a dry grass field. I knew that that was a lie, and that there was an intentional burning. The fire was meant to eliminate that thing, but I don't think it worked, because a week later, someone went missing in a part of the woods nearby that was untouched by the flames. We never solved this case, because technically, the man is still missing, but I'm never going back into that area again. It's been 15 years since I was last there, and I will go the rest of my life avoiding it. Some places need to be avoided the same way some things don't need to be understood. I will finish by saying that if you see a campsite closed, and it says that there's maintenance going on, don't believe it. For all you know, there could be another beast lurking in the mist. Be safe out there. I'm a 17-year-old guy, currently living in Phoenix, Arizona. This incident took place around 6 months ago on an overnight trip into the Superstition Mountains, which are about an hour drive east of Phoenix. I'm not going to specify the exact trail because I've been doing this stuff long enough to realize what happens when you post stuff on the internet. Whether it's a good trail, abandoned mine, ghosts, or whatever it may be, people come flocking, and usually with a lot of trash and loud music. Anyway, this particular trail I was taking was an 8-mile loop through a canyon. Pretty simple in and out overnight trip. I had planned to go with my friend, but a last-minute cancel on his part left me on my own. So, with a packed bag and my car ready to go, I decided to go on my own. Not leaving the house on time, and some trouble navigating rough forest roads, I didn't arrive at the trailhead until around 5:45, which, for those of you who don't backpack, this is a very big no-no. I had about a 4-mile hike until I arrived at my planned camping spot, and it was getting dark fast, so I figured if I moved quick enough, I could get at least 2 to 3 miles in before I had to find a spot. This strategy left me hiking a very dark trail on my own, with about 15 miles of dirt road between me and anyone else. Hiking in the dark by itself is scary, especially for where I was and being on my own. Eventually, it got so dark I could only see where my headlamp was pointing, and that's when I figured I needed to stop and get my camp set up. Only using the headlamp as my light source and trying to move fast, I ended up in a less than ideal spot. There was some burnt pieces of wood and the remains of a fire circle, so it looked like people had been there before, but definitely not recently. My first priority was to get a fire going. I scanned the area around me and was able to find some dry wood, and I got the fire going. I got my tarp set up and cracked open a can of chili mac I had brought for myself and was very much looking forward to eating. I was feeling good. My camp was set up and my food was on the fire. The feeling of uneasiness from the hike in had almost gone away, but it was still there. Side effect of camping alone in remote areas. To fully understand what happened, I have to explain how my camp was set up. The site I had picked was a small clearing surrounded by large pine trees, with the trail about 30 feet to my left. There was a small circle of light from my fire, and everything past it was pitch black. I was sitting on the ground near my fire, eating my dinner, when a small rock about the size of a marble was thrown into my camp. I looked at the tiny rock in shock, as I was positive I was the only person on the trail that night. I immediately turned my light and faced it toward the area where I had seen the rock come from. Due to the density of the pines and brush, I could only see about 10 feet. I spent the next 15 minutes in disbelief as I scanned the tree line that surrounded me, searching for what or whoever had thrown the rock, not daring to stray too far from my fire. After sitting back down and spending the rest of my time on high alert, I was able to convince myself that I had somehow kicked the rock, or it had fallen from a tree. That night, I awoke to the sound of rustling leaves, barely audible, but still there. I was still in a sleepy daze as I listened. The rustling of leaves got harder to hear, and I assumed they were moving away from me. I went to grab my handheld flashlight that I had left next to me when I had fallen asleep, but I soon came to realize that it was no longer there. I stood up in my sleeping bag and ducked out of the tarp and looked around. I was able to see a light off in the woods. It couldn't have been more than 15 feet away. It was my flashlight, laying on the ground on a pile of leaves. The flashlight that I had left sitting right next to me when I had fallen asleep a few hours ago was now 15 feet away from me, past the tree line. I quickly slipped my boots, clutched my knife in the other hand, and keeping my head on a swivel, I weighed my options. Stay here and wait out the night, or attempt the 3-mile hike back to the car in the dark. I figured that whatever, or whoever was out there with me, was definitely going to have a better advantage if I was on the trail without a light. I decided to stay at the camp and waited out the night there. Eventually, it came back. I could hear it walking through the woods. It was far off, but I could hear it. It sounded like someone was leisurely walking by, like they were on a stroll without a care in the world. Sometimes it would walk far away, and I would lose the sound of its steps, but then it would return, still faint as ever. This went on for about 3 or 4 hours, until the steps got closer and closer. Now they were about 7 feet from me. At this point, the fire had become very small, as I had run out of wood in my pile. The footsteps stopped, and everything went totally silent. I sat there still for 2 hours, clutching my knife in my hand and praying I wouldn't hear anything else. I stayed like that until the sun cast enough light that I could see that I was alone in my campsite. I packed my things and speed-walked the 3 miles down the trail I had taken. I arrived at the empty dirt road where my car was parked. I nearly sprinted to my Subaru as I unlocked it, jumped in and drove, not stopping until I had put at least 20 miles between me and that place. I ended up in a gas station in Apache Junction to buy some Red Bull, but mostly just to see and or talk to another person. As I exited the store, I was able to read something that was written in the dust on the back window of my car. It said, "Sleep well." This story happened during my teenage years, at 15 or 16 years old. I lived in a small town of 2,000 people. mainly surrounded by boreal forest in a region of Quebec, Canada. This place was great, as we often saw deer, and it was usually a quiet and safe place. To give a bit of context, my house was located at the end of a dead-end street, and the only light source at night was my house's. There was a single street light at the end of the road, but it only lit up part of the street and the forest behind it. We were a dog family. I only had small dogs when I lived there. Every day we needed to let them out to pee, as all dogs do, but at night they were almost impossible to see because of the darkness. Our terrain was kind of big, and the light sources were weak. I was a gamer at the time, and I was often up late, so I was the one who needed to take the dog out to pee at 2 a.m. because it stayed with me while I was playing. One night, I opened the door and waited for my dog to do his thing. While trying to look at it, I was only able to see the reflection of the light in its eyes when it looked at me. I started to look around, because there was sometimes deer sleeping in the woods under the streetlight, or wild turkeys roaming around, when a little dark spot caught my attention. It looked like a human head coming out of the bushes, but I wasn't able to see it, because it was a bit in the dark. I don't want my dog to run after whatever it was. It had a tendency to run after wild animals, so I called to it. It didn't listen to me, but the thing in the bushes started to crawl towards the street, slowly. It looked like a human, with thin limbs and a normal body, and a slightly long neck. I started to freak out a bit, and shook the treats cup so my dog would hurry. It came inside running, and I shut the door as fast as I could. I turned off the lights in my house, so I could have a view of what was outside. The strange animal crawled fast, almost running like a dog with every limb broken, as an improvised crawling movement. The animal passed under the light, where I saw it had no fur, like a shaved animal. It was disgusting. I was afraid, and standing in the dark. The animal ran towards the light and continued on the street, where I wasn't able to see it because the houses in my neighborhood were surrounded by trees. I locked the door and went to sleep with my dog. I talked to nobody about it. A couple months later, I went to bed kinda early, 11 p.m., and went to watch some videos on my phone. They were gaming videos, and I had earphones on. A sound on the video was recurring, and I thought it was annoying, like a distant, weird scream. After a couple minutes, the video finished, and I went to see another, but during the loading, the sound occurred. I took my earphones off and waited for the sound. I heard it, and immediately had tears in my eyes. It was coming from my window. My room was at the second floor, so I looked down in the forest to see if there was some movement. The only light near the forest entrance was the moonlight, and an underwater light in a pool that emitted a small halo around it. I wasn't able to see anything, but the sound occurred again. It was like a mix between a distorted scream and a pig having its throat slit, or a strong pain whining from a dog. I looked down and saw an animal that passed so fast that it was hard to really see, but I barely saw a human-sized animal with wings crawling like a spider. It wasn't running after anything, but the sound occurred another time. It was the most horrible thing I ever heard. I closed my window to choke a bit by the sound of it. I heard it again 3 other times, and it stopped after that. I talked to my dad about the sound, and he told me it was probably a deer being attacked by a wild animal. I was so scared of it, I barely walked in the woods at night the 3 following years, before moving in a city to go at a university. Even to this day, I never heard of an animal like that, and it made me really doubt my mental health at the time, because I had PTSD from a dog attack mid-middle school, and I sometimes had light hallucinations when I gamed for too long, like a black shadow that disappears immediately, or things like that. There were barely any reports of wolves, coyotes, or bears in my area, and believe me, I made a lot of discoveries exploring the forest in this town. It was almost 15 years ago now that I first met one of the most interesting people I know. True to that nature, I also met him in one of the most interesting and unexpected ways. I was out hiking on a trail in Washington State. It was a remote area, but one which I was fairly familiar with. On that particular day, I decided to venture far beyond the hiking trail I normally took, just for the sake of exploration. After some time, I entered a sunlit gully which led up to a local mountain, rife with blooming conifers and serene, glistening pines. I was also alone that day, and felt my soul rejuvenate a bit with every breath of fresh mountain air. After probably 20 minutes, I was well off the beaten trail, and I found something worrying. I was about to take another step when I paused mid-stride, seeing a circular, jagged metal ring laying just behind a small shrub. It was a good thing I didn't put my foot down, as the ring proved to be an improvised bear trap. "What are you doing out here?" A gruff male voice suddenly shouted from somewhere unseen. I looked around, trying to find the person who had spoken, when he chose to step forward and reveal himself. An older man sporting a long gray beard then emerged from the brush. He had amber skin, long grayish black dreadlocks, and a scar on his right cheek. He wore a raggedy brown coat that looked hand-woven, and old jeans patched in multiple spots by mismatched fabric. His eyes burned like campfires, and his hands clutched a bolt-action rifle while his lip cradled a sizable wad of chew. "I asked you a question, son. What are you doing here?" After fumbling on my words for a moment, I was finally able to piece together a response. "I was just hiking. Sorry. I didn't know anyone lived out here." The man seemed to silently inspect me for a moment. I felt my pulse soar in my chest, as I wondered what he was intending on doing. We were, after all, completely alone out there. "You see that bear trap, son?" He pointed to the same trap that I had narrowly avoided stepping on a minute earlier. I nodded. He tilted to the side and spewed a mouthful of tobacco spit into the dirt. "Guess that means I gotta hide him better." He stared at me, completely emotionless, and I felt my heart plunge into the depths of my stomach. I thought he was some maniac hillbilly cannibal, hell-bent on having me for lunch. But then he burst into a fit of raspy laughter. I was left there confused and partially horrified as the man continued to cackle for several seconds. "Oh, I'm just kidding, son." He wiped a tear from his eye and recomposed himself as I continued silently debating whether or not I should run. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and smiled at me. "Apologies, buddy. My wife always says my sense of humor was a bit dark." I eyed the man over, and he suddenly seemed less sinister than he had a moment ago.
Yes, the fuck.
There was this sense of jubilance in his gaze, like he was genuinely happy to see me. It's hard to explain, but it kept me from running. I forced a laugh myself. Good thing for the both of us, I guess. This hiking has given me a major case of swamp sweat. I can't imagine I'd taste too good. The man burst into laughter once more, and this time I joined in. In that moment, I knew I had found a new friend. The man formally introduced himself not long after as Mark Hastings. After conversing for a while, he told me that he had lived in that particular area for a couple of years at least, though admitted he didn't know exactly how long he'd been there. He said he left city life behind in '96 and seemed quite surprised when I told him the current year was 2020. Mark's accent was something which struck me as quite interesting, as it was one I couldn't quite pin down. He had a significant southern drawl, and yet at times also sounded as though he may have had a bit of British influence as well. He pronounced words like again as again, and had
black
Yeah,
and
he's
white
close.
movies, proper, and yet somehow country. We got to talking, and he told me more about himself.
Gloves I'm
He
wearing
said he
are
used
supposed to
do
be like
construction back in the day, but when his wife got sick
touch-proof,
with cancer,
but
it
whatever.
really changed things for him. He said she battled for almost
Should be able
3
to
years,
touch the
but eventually
screen.
lost the fight. Afterwards, he was left alone with a mountain of medical bills to account for. Rather than pay them off and attempt to move forward, Mark chose a different path. It's funny. Gray eyes as he said it, and I felt myself feeling sorry for him. He wasn't all what I expected when we first met. Just a normal guy whose life fell apart through no fault of his own. In a way, I found it sort of admirable. The system beat him down, and rather than just accept it and be a good little wage slave, he left it all behind with a big middle finger. I visited Mark pretty regularly after that, and tried to make the trek to see him at least once a month. He always seemed to have a smile on his face when I came to visit. Soon enough, he even invited me back to his cabin for a fresh meal and some drinks. I was a bit hesitant at first, but decided to accept. Part of me expected him to prepare a meal of squirrels and tree bark when he first offered, but I couldn't have been more wrong. Mark made us a fresh rabbit stew with some homegrown potatoes and bread that he had made from scratch. On top of that, he even had his own home-brewed ale to wash it all down. It was surprisingly delicious, and really made me admire Mark more for his resourcefulness. He wasn't just some wannabe camper. He was truly a man of the land. His cabin was reminiscent of one that would have been used by the early 18th century trappers. A handcrafted stone chimney was his only source of heat, while animal pelts covered the walls and stripes of meat were lying on his jerky rack. There were 2 couches in the main room, constructed of whittled wood bearing hand-woven pillows stuffed with feathers. He had no electronics of any kind, claiming he didn't need those technological doohickeys anyways. Mark had 2 hounds, Rowley and Daisy, that lived there with him and were his only real companions. I eventually asked if he ever missed civilization or got lonely out there, but he immediately refuted the question. For a while, yeah, but not anymore. It's easy to forget about society when society already forgot about you. I really grew to admire Mark and even cherish our friendship. Over our many meetings, he would tell me stories about his life, told me all about his business and wife before she passed. The way he spoke about her in particular truly broke my heart. He was a man who met his soulmate and built a life he loved with her, only to have it all ripped away by the cruel hands of fate. More than anything, though, Mark was always ready to tell me how much he'd hated the government. I think that's what made me like him the most. One night, he and I were drinking some of his home-brewed honey ale and chilling around his campfire. He had just got done telling a story about a 5-point buck that he had narrowly missed a few weeks earlier. He finished with admitting that he heard some weird, loud noise from the woods that scared it off before he could fire. That detail got me thinking, and since I've always been a fan of the paranormal, with a smug grin. Zach, I tell ya, you don't know creepy until you've spent some time out here. He then began to tell me a story of when he had first began living out there. He said it took him close to a year to finally assemble his cabin, at least partially. During that time, he and his dogs were living in a simple tent. Mark said that a couple weeks after living there, he started noticing something odd. Every once in a while, he'd awake to find deceased animals just outside the perimeter of his camp. Usually, it was just small creatures like rabbits, birds, and squirrels. But it didn't stay that way. Over time, Mark began finding more and more things left at his camp.
He thought it was the work of a puma at first, despite the fact that the corpses seemed to retain most of the meat. He quickly rethought that through when he found an actual puma corpse one morning. He said most of the animals had marks along their sides and necks, and many had been turned inside out. He began thinking it was the work of some deranged person, but even that didn't last long. One night, as he was preparing to turn in for the evening, he heard a rustling sound coming from within the forest. He ducked down underneath some timber in hopes of catching a glimpse of the culprit. Both of his dogs were already chained up for the night, so he knew it couldn't have been one of them. A figure emerged deeper into the woods. Mark said he didn't see the entire thing, but he could tell that this thing was bipedal and scrawny. I asked if it could have been a bear with mange, but Mark claimed it was too skinny for that. He said he'd seen 6 bears before, and they looked and moved nothing like that thing. Mark initially planned on trying to shoot it, but after seeing that, he admitted that he didn't think that would have been a good idea. The creature dropped something on the perimeter, which Mark discovered the following morning was a raccoon. The thing's head then tilted and appeared to stare directly towards Mark. They just stared there in silence for several seconds, until the dogs began snarling ferociously from inside the tent. They must have caught its scent, and the thing suddenly crouched on all fours and dashed back off into the woods as the dogs went ballistic. Mark didn't know what he had seen that night, and apparently never saw it again. To me, it sounded like a Wendigo or a skinwalker based on
I'm not
his
sure
description.
how that would even be.
I told him that,
It's
but
like
he had
way
no
too-
idea what those things
No,
were.
no.
He seemed to think that
Never
the thing was
mind.
actually leaving him gifts.
I was gonna try
I wasn't
using
so
this.
sure about that. I asked him about the typical creatures seen in creepypastas and
But the
television
angle
shows.
will not be good,
The
so
Wendigos, skinwalkers,
never mind.
Slender, the rake, siren
It's
head,
kind of cold.
and some of the well-known others.
It's like
But Mark didn't seem to know anything about any.
39.
He did, however, know about something he called the Whistler. Apparently, ever since he had been out there, he had heard an odd whistling sound on occasion. It would start off as a little more than a dull, barely audible noise in the distance. He said at times it would come closer, and at others it seemed like it was further away. Mark thought it was a bird the longest time, but one night he found the truth. He was chopping wood when suddenly the whistling noise emerged. This time it was different, and it was closer than ever before. Suddenly, there was a rustling noise from behind him. Mark spun back, but only saw a few branches bristling back and forth. He then heard the whistle again, louder than ever before. He looked up, and there it was. About 20 feet up in a large oak tree was some kind of figure. Mark described it as kind of human, with a head that looked like some messed up eel. He said he saw the thing stare down at him with beady black eyes. He just froze, and before he could do anything, the thing suddenly leapt from the tree. It crashed into another, further away, and continued whistling and crashing as it blended into the depths of the woods. I didn't know what to say to that. I have heard legends about the whistlers out in the woods, but I've never heard about anyone actually
zip my
having seen
jacket.
one of them. The way he described it sounded quite creative, and I wondered whether he was capable of an imagination so elaborate, or if he had actually seen what he claimed. I asked him whether he thought this whistler was the same creature that was leaving him items, but he just shook his head. Without being prompted, he told me another tale about hearing voices in the woods sometimes that of a young girl, and sometimes it didn't sound human at all. I wondered whether my new friend was perhaps schizophrenic, or suffered some mental illness that caused him to hear these things. I obviously didn't tell him that, but his claims had to be met with some amount of skepticism. What do you think it was? Mark leaned back, and his head swiveled on his shoulders. No clue, son, and part of me hopes I never find out. He went on to explain that he continued to hear voices on occasion, but never saw who or what was making them. He seemed to think all of the voices were coming from the same entity, though. Without being prompted, he took the conversation in an entirely new, accusatory direction. It's the dang government, Zach. Messing with things they got no business messing with. He then delved into a conspiratorial rant about how the government, and specifically the guys in black trucks, that were up to some really shady antics. He said they knew about gates in the forest, and had been actively trying to open them. He didn't elaborate on exactly what he meant by that. You see them out here? You know, government, CIA? Mark looked confused. CIA? He asked. It was my turn to look confused then. Yeah, the Central Intelligence Agency. You know, Men in Black? Mark still appeared slightly puzzled. I didn't understand how a guy like him who hated the government to such an extreme degree had apparently never heard of the mother of all conspiracy agencies like the CIA. He then seemed to have an epiphany, and his eyes lit up in recognition. Oh yeah, I forgot about them. He then laughed and shook his head as he downed another swig of ale. My memory ain't what it used to be, I'm afraid. Dang, how could I forget them? Well, in my defense, they don't carry no badges out here, and their vehicles don't exactly advertise who they work for. He paused and rubbed the back of his neck. But you've seen them out here. Mark met my eyes and nodded, without a doubt. Mark told me that one time he had been tracking an elk through the woods in late autumn. He'd followed the trail for a few miles, when suddenly he heard a noise coming from a grove up ahead. It sounded nothing like a bear though, and more like several people arguing. Mark crept slowly forward, taking care not to disturb the foliage and remain out of sight. After a couple seconds, he saw the outlines of several people emerge in the grove. One man was on his knees in the center, while 4 men in black suits surrounded him. The man on his knees had wounds and bruises, and his clothing was torn and tattered. He was asking the others for mercy, but they didn't appear to be the forgiving type. 2 of the men were speaking quietly to one another, while the other 2 stood over to watch their apparent captive. The man on his knees was dressed in white, with Mark describing his clothes as looking like a surgeon's uniform, or maybe the attire of someone from an insane asylum. He listened, but couldn't make out what the 2 other men were talking about, but they were clearly arguing. The man on his knees appeared to be weeping softly. Mark said he didn't know what to do, and before he could do anything, one of the 2 men who had previously been arguing stepped away. Without a word, the man stepped behind the captive, lifted the weapon, and pulled the trigger. Mark described seeing a splash of red, but said the weapon made a lot less noise than he thought it would have. The man in white fell down onto the dirt. Holy crap, I said, mouth falling agape as Mark concluded his story. I eyed him closely, but didn't see any aura or boasting in his eyes. They didn't twinkle like that of a man who tried telling a fabricated story to simply amaze or impress an audience. He didn't look at me at all, as a matter of fact. He just clasped his hands in front of his mouth and stared at the campfire with a somber gaze. It was clear to me that he was either an accomplished actor, or what he had witnessed truly haunted him. Poor boy, couldn't have been much older than you. I wish I would have done something, but I just ran. He shook his head, and his eyes seemed to glaze over. I just stayed quiet, as there's nothing I could think to say. After a couple moments of lingering silence, Mark finally spoke again. Zach, I gotta tell you a secret.
The last time I was here, there was like a tree down, and you could like barely even see the path. So I got like off path. And also the last time I was here, I was supposed to walk to the shelter that's up here. And the shelter It's not too far, but it's like an hour at most. And the last time I was here, it was also sunny, and the sun was like in my eyes the whole walk back. So that was not fun.
But wasn't entirely convinced that he witnessed what he thought he had. You sure it was government that did that? Could have been drug dealers.
The shelter should be interesting. I've never seen them in PA.
Side chuckled.
Only in New Jersey and Vermont.
Didn't have a response. Well, I see why.
And yeah,
But that's because you ain't
I didn't go to the one in Maine because my knee was like all messed up. I couldn't, like I physically couldn't make it.
about the tunnels. I peeked an eyebrow at that comment. Tunnels? Mark grinned and nodded back. There are a series of tunnels that run deep below the earth. Gotta be a couple dozen of them within a few miles of us now.
And my knee was all messed up because I did Mount Mansfield and then Mount Moose Leak.
I think they're just
And then I did the Mount Lafayette, like all back to back to back. So
now on the edge of my seat.
that wasn't, I guess, a great idea.
I have no idea, but it's gotta be.
Even though I guess it was worth it.
I was a bit disappointed with that answer, but Mark immediately drew my curiosity back.
Minus the view at Mount Mansfield.
I nodded without really even thinking. Mark agreed. I figured you might. It's a bit late in the day to go now, so what do you say we head out of here first thing in the morning? I agreed without hesitance, and I promised to
Like these
return
areas are pretty cool.
with Mark.
The Appalachian Trail throughout
Down the trail that day,
Pennsylvania.
my imagination running wild. As I mentioned, I liked Mark very much and enjoyed our conversation. To me, he was
But
somewhat
they're
a
not, like the
compassionate
mountains
friend
aren't as big.
with a plethora
And
of
it's not as
intellectual
isolated
may not have been slightly exaggerated.
as that area in Vermont.
About the found animals and the
And like basically all of Maine.
I wanted to believe him, but urban
Which,
legends
like in my opinion, Maine's like the best spot to like hike the Appalachian Trail.
concocted these stories after his decades of isolation.
To be honest,
I needed to see some proof for myself.
it's like the most like intense, like rugged, remote area.
It was a bit chilly as I walked, but thoughts of the unknown kept me warm as I went on. Before long, I arrived at Mark and I's usual meeting spot and found him already waiting there for me. He greeted me, and without hesitation, we began to trek out to his spot. We made small talk on the way, mostly about normal topics, like family and work. After maybe 15 minutes of walking, we rounded a small bend tucked behind a small grove of trees. Mark stepped out in front of a tree to face me.
But there's just like something different about being on the Appalachian Trail than like another trail.
There was an opening in the side
Like
of the
there's
hill.
just like, I don't even want to say there's like an energy,
It was quite enormous.
but it's just like, I don't know. I guess it's like iconic, but you don't even realize it when you're on it. It's just like a normal trail, but it like gives you like energy to like be on the Appalachian Trail
Mark nodded.
more so than other trails.
It wasn't sealed up like this last time I was here. How long ago was that? Mark shrugged. Don't know. Maybe a year or two. I looked back at the collapsed tunnel. It was clear that someone had gone through a great deal of effort to construct it, but the construction didn't look like a mining operation. I'm no expert in mining or anything, but I can't imagine they would spend the time laying brick and creating such a wide entrance. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but the more curious fact was why it had been sealed up. I thought maybe it was just vandals, but that explanation somehow didn't satisfy. What's inside? I asked.
It's like hard to explain, but it's like specifically the Appalachian Trail. It's like when you walk on it, you like get like into like this weird mindset, and it's like almost puts you like in a different type of like reality.
I mean, it had to be for someone to seal it up like that.
It's like hard to experience or explain unless you're like on the Appalachian Trail.
He was right about that, but I still felt that there was information that he was withholding from me. You think this is the government's work? Mark nodded. Not a single doubt in my mind about it. Mark's head then suddenly flicked to the side, and he stared into the trees as if something had alerted him. I watched the color drain from his cheeks as his mouth pursed open. We shouldn't go. I don't
Not
like
wearing
lingering
the
here for
best
too long.
shoes,
I didn't
but
argue.
they're
They're
like partially waterproof,
back to his cabin, checking his snares
but
on
they
the way
work.
back. Mark found a pair of rabbits in his traps, and after swiftly slung
Because
them
my
over his
pants
shoulder,
keep falling
we
down.
got back to his cabin, and Mark set to work on harvesting the meat from the rabbits for his stew. I sat around, petting Daisy and Rowley, as they slobbered all over my knee and panted endlessly. I don't think I ever told you the scariest part about living out here, did I? Mark asked. I looked up from the two dogs and stared at him, heart now beating with excitement. Mark sauntered over, carrying the meat of the rabbits along with the clump of chopped vegetables. He dumped the plate into the simmering
I
cold.
think I honestly want to record the whole hike, but I'm already at 76%, and I should have brought my other two batteries, but I wasn't planning on just recording like a live stream, but it's like not a live stream. I couldn't even really do a live stream out here because there's no signal, so it wouldn't even work,
But there is something that can.
or it wouldn't be good quality, so
I call it the silence. He paused, as if to allow the words to emasculate the dread he felt they deserved. I had an inkling of an idea where the conversation was headed, but just waited for him to explain. There's been rumors about it for a very long time, and it's something that has just been affecting humanity for centuries, if not millennia. People have only just begun to realize it, but if they knew the true extent of what's going on, well, no one would ever go into the woods ever again. He paused and leaned in to stir the pot a bit before sitting back. People disappear, Zach. No reason for it, no explanation, no bodies are ever found. The cases seem to defy all explanation, and it happens again and again. Mark then suddenly grunted, began rubbing his eye. Oh, dang smoke. Sorry, where was I? The disappearances, I replied. Mark seemed suddenly hesitant, as if he didn't know whether or not he should continue. Yeah, the disappearances. I don't particularly like talking about this, if I'm being honest. It's not really my business. But you're a good kid, Zach. And I know you come out here a lot. And I'd be devastated if anything were to happen to you. Dread crept around me like dozens of little spiders scurrying on my skin. I couldn't help but raise my guard and wonder where exactly this conversation was headed. Mark went on to tell me about this silence he mentioned. He said that if I was ever walking through the woods and everything went completely silent, I was to drop to my knees and put my face to the dirt immediately. He said to stay that way until the sounds returned to normal. And what if sound doesn't come back? I asked, spine tingling with anxiety. Mark looked me straight in the eye, and his words offered nothing of comfort. Then God help you. He said no more about the subject, and I didn't push him on it. It was clear he wasn't really comfortable discussing it beyond his initial warning. If he had any theories about what was responsible, he didn't voice them. The whole conversation had given me a strong missing 411 vibes, and I wondered whether he was referring to the same phenomenon. Both of us just sort of lingered in silence for a while as the stew finished cooking. After a few minutes, Mark leaned in and scooped 2 servings into bowls, handing one of them to me. The stew was delicious, as usual, and I happily scarfed it down as Mark provided his hounds with their dinner as well, although didn't so much as nibble on his own serving. What do you know about mimics? I don't know why exactly I asked, but the thought had suddenly arisen in my mind. Mark seemed to perk up, but yet stared back with a look of confusion that seemed to contradict his reaction. I'm sorry, what? Mimics, I clarified. Some call them imposters or liars. Things that look and try to act human, but aren't. Mark stared back at me, and a small grin slithered onto his face. Now what would make you ask a question like that? Mark's grin evaporated as he stared back with something akin to contempt. Truth is, some of the things I'd seen from him made me question who he claimed he was. There was just a subtle wrongness to him, in a way I've never felt the words to accurately describe. Just curious, I replied, staring back. Mark chuckled, but without any humor in his tone. Your kind always is. Ever since your brothers took up arms against one another in the war of gray and blue, your curiosity has been quite insatiable. You think this land belongs to you. Like this country is your own personal proving grounds to pillage and destroy as you please. His form seemed to shift as he spoke, his eyes shrinking in their sockets, and his skin seemed to twitch. His teeth bared like fangs of a cougar, and his long black hair flowing like a clump of wild eels. He leaned forward, in a look that no longer seemed entirely human. Zach, there are things out here that your world of science and logic will never understand, and these things are better left alone. He and I just stared at one another, and I felt my heart beating. I thought about his words, the war of gray and blue. Could he have been referring to the American Civil War? Why reference that event specifically? What year did you say you moved out here? I asked.
It was June of 1988, and 71-year-old Myra Davis could hardly contain her excitement. Just when she thought her working days were over, the former Hollywood actress was suddenly back in the entertainment business. As Myra stepped out the front door of her modest home in Cheviot Hills, California, the attractive grandmother with the high cheekbones and easy... The crime that would eventually put Timothy Evans on death row was horrific. But when you take a look at Timothy Evans' past, it's not really a shocker that his life played out the way that it did. Before Timothy was even born in 1924 in the southern end of Wales, his father had abandoned him and his siblings and his mother. And because Timothy's mother made almost no money, when Timothy was born, he was effectively born into poverty. As a young child, Timothy really struggled to learn how to speak properly, and then in school, he just really struggled to keep up with his peers. To make matters worse, when Timothy was 8 years old, he contracted tuberculosis of the skin on the underside of his right foot. This condition is not necessarily fatal, but it causes these large, painful blisters that take a really long time to go away, even with treatment. And because Timothy's outbreak was on the underside of his foot, it made walking nearly impossible. And so for a few years, starting when he was 8 years old and he was diagnosed with tuberculosis of the skin, Timothy had to miss huge chunks of his schooling to get medical treatment. And then other times he was missing school simply because he couldn't walk. And considering how poorly Timothy was already doing in school, these huge extended absences were totally catastrophic for his education. In fact, later in life, it would be determined that Timothy's IQ, which is a way to measure people's intelligence, was somewhere between 60 and 70, which is very low and put him in the range of having an intellectual disability. Not long after his tuberculosis of the skin diagnosis, Timothy would remain in school despite all of these absences and despite how difficult it was for him. But his real focus would shift from getting an education to trying to find work in order to help provide for his family, who were very poor. And Timothy was willing to do just about anything for money. For example, when he was only 13 years old, he became a coal miner, one of the most dangerous jobs on the planet at the time, and still today. But despite Timothy's willingness to do these really challenging jobs that often paid very little, he would always eventually get fired, or he just would not get the job in the first place. He would be rejected. And always, it was because either one, he had a flare-up of his tuberculosis on his foot, which made it impossible to walk, and so he couldn't go to and from his job, and so he'd be let go. Or it would be because of his illiteracy, and the job just could not take someone in that could not read, write, or really even speak very well. Or in some cases, like when Timothy tried to join the military when he was 18 years old and World War II was raging and all of his peers are going off to fight the war, well, when he tried to enlist, the military said, we can't take you because you are illiterate and because of your foot. This constant cycle of rejection and embarrassment really made Timothy quite cynical. He felt like he just didn't belong anywhere. And so at some point, perhaps as a coping mechanism, Timothy began to lie. He'd make up tall tales about the adventures he'd been on and all the influential people he knew and the superhuman skills he possessed. Now, most people who knew Timothy didn't believe any of the stories he told, but every now and again, some people actually did. And for Timothy, that little sliver of respect he would get in that moment, even though it was built on a lie, on an illusion, it was incredible for him. He didn't get that anywhere else in his life, and so he kind of became addicted to telling these lies. Fast forward to 1947, Timothy was 23 years old, and he was still living with his family, who had left Wales and had moved to London, and they were living in a very, very poor and dangerous neighborhood. At the time, Timothy had managed to get a job as a delivery driver and had yet to be fired from it, and on one of his daily routes around the city, he wound up meeting an 18-year-old girl named Beryl Thorley, who he really took a liking to. Now, according to people who knew Beryl, she apparently, like Timothy, had a very low IQ. And so Beryl and Timothy, they meet on one of Timothy's routes, and they immediately hit it off and they start dating, and by the end of that year, they were married. They initially lived inside of Timothy's family's apartment, but when Beryl became pregnant in early 1948, she and Timothy pooled what little money they had, and they got an apartment of their own. Their new apartment was terrible. It was tiny, it was dirty, it was located in an even more dangerous neighborhood than where Timothy's family lived, but it was good enough for them, at least at first. Once Beryl gave birth to their daughter, Geraldine, suddenly their cramped living quarters seemed impossibly small for a family of three. And they were already extremely tight on money, and now adding a baby to the mix, they really just did not have enough money to survive. Timothy immediately tried picking up extra work wherever he could, but once again, his illiteracy and his foot, or a combination of the two, held him back. And so it wasn't long before the couple was forced to start taking out these awful high-interest loans that they knew they would never be able to pay back. So they are permanently saddled with debt. They know it. And these loans are only enough to barely get by. This is not enough to move out. This is only enough to stay in their squalid and awful conditions. And so as their debt piled up, in conjunction with all the stresses of being new parents and living in this really cramped space, it wasn't long before Beryl and Timothy's marriage just totally started to erode. It started with daily arguing over one of their many hardships, but it quickly escalated to full-blown physical confrontation that often was so loud that passerby outside in the very busy street would hear, coming from the third floor, Timothy and Beryl screaming and yelling and punching each other, to the point where people outside literally stopped and just looked up, wondering what was going on up there. As Timothy's world seemed to just kind of crumble all around him, he at first turned to a coping mechanism he had used for most of his life, and that was just to lie about his current situation. He would tell people who would listen that he and his wife and his kid were doing great and everything was fine. But, behind closed doors, that wasn't true at all, and so that coping mechanism really didn't do a lot for him. And so Timothy eventually turned to alcohol to cope with his misery. But the alcohol would only make the situation worse because it was yet another thing for his wife to be mad at him about, and he was depressed all the time, and it was eating away at their non-existent budget to pay for all this alcohol. And so Timothy would turn to yet another source for comfort, but it would be a very unlikely source of comfort. It would be his downstairs neighbor, John Christie. And the reason his downstairs neighbor was so unlikely was because John could not have been more different from Timothy. John was nearly double Timothy's age. He was incredibly smart, and he was respected not only by his peers, but really by the community. And that respect came from the fact that John had served during World War I and been right on the front lines, and had nearly been killed during a mustard gas attack when he was fighting in the trenches. And then after the war was over, John would come back to London, and he would become a police constable for quite a while, and then after retiring from the force, he became a post office clerk. But despite John and Timothy's vast differences, there was one thing they had in common: marital problems. John and his wife Ethel had gotten married back in 1920, so 4 years before Timothy had even been born. But at some point early on in their marriage, the couple had split up. They didn't get divorced, but they separated, and they lived totally apart for a while. But in 1934, the couple would finally reconcile, and that's when they moved into the ground floor apartment of the apartment building that Timothy and Beryl would move into years later. So, years later, when John is sitting in his apartment and he can hear coming from the third floor, like everybody else in the general vicinity, the sound of Timothy and Beryl fighting like crazy up in their apartment, John decided, with his experience with reconciling with his wife, that he ought to reach out to that young man, Timothy, and offer him some advice, or at the very least, be a friendly sounding board. And so John would eventually strike up a conversation with Timothy one day when they were passing each other, and Timothy was at a place in his life where he was looking for friends. He didn't have any friends. And so John, to come into his life at this point, was really good for Timothy, and so very quickly those two struck up a friendship. But this friendship was not really peer-to-peer. It was more like father to son or mentor to mentee, where Timothy really looked up to John. I mean, Timothy had never had There are many extreme religious practices and...
Today's video is sponsored by Audible. Warning. The following content may be considered disturbing to some. Viewer discretion is advised.
Yard, and it was clear. I looked out every window in my house to make sure it wasn't just waiting outside, but I didn't see any sign of it. I tried to convince myself I was delusional. It was all just my imagination, or I was sick. But my car still has the damage from hitting the deer, and scratches all over the back from the thing's antlers. There was no denying that. A quick shower and a change of clothes had me feeling a little more at ease. But my lack of sleep was starting to catch up with me. I had to go to work though, and that meant going back down that road. I could detour around it, but I wanted to see if that deer was still laying on the side of the road. The car started as usual, and I found myself driving to work on autopilot. My thoughts went back to last night's events, and I nearly lost my nerve to keep going. But I reasoned that in the day it would be safe for me to go down that road. Traffic was heavier during the day, and for once I was thankful there would be more people than just me on that road. But when I was approaching the road, I saw multiple police cars with their sirens on. They were blocking off the road. Testing my luck, I rolled down my window as I approached the turn and decided to ask the officer what was going on. "This road closed? Something happened down there?" I asked the officer. "Yeah, the road's closed for now. You can go up the next road and cut through there if you need a detour." He was not forthcoming on the reason, so I tried a second time. "Can I ask why you're closing it? Was there an accident?" "Right now, I can't say anything for certain." The policeman looked around before leaning in and speaking softly. "This was no car accident. All I can say." I gave him a quick thanks and began to slowly drive off. Peering down the road as best as I could, I noticed an ambulance there. An ominous feeling came over me and I started to think about the deer creature. I saw a group of men who appeared to be field workers, judging by their slightly dirty clothes and gloves. They all frowned as they silently sat outside the barricade of the police cars, and one of them appeared to be crying. I pulled my car over and decided to ask if they knew anything. "You guys know anything about why the road is closed?" I asked. The group of guys just looked at me, and then at each other, but one of them stepped forward and spoke to me reluctantly.
Cheekbones and easy smile.
Fuck, that was like a good story.
But after... Okay. The rest of their trip went along nicely with... He told me it was a skinwalker, and it was going to hunt me until it loses my scent. My uncle's house. It sounded like a wolf's screams. I ran in the direction of my about it, now that it was in the streetlight. Not only was its eyes dog-like, but the face was no longer human, but looked like a coyote.
There are many extreme religious practices and rituals.
Like a coyote now. Possible explanation, but none of them seem entirely plausible. It certainly wasn't my mother playing a prank. There was no way that she could have pulled it off. Not to mention the fact that she'd never been one to play pranks. I also highly doubt it was anyone else, because as I stated before, we lived in a secluded area. The closest neighbor was at least a mile away, and I wasn't personally acquainted with any of them. How could they have known my name and where to find me? We've since moved out of that house, but my mother and I occasionally discuss the incident. She still claims she had never heard or saw anything unusual out there. I know it probably shouldn't, but what happened in those woods continues to bother me. I spent many hours out there prior to that day, and never had anything out of the ordinary occur. The best explanation I have at this point is a doppelganger, possibly a skinwalker, but I'm unsure. If anyone has any possible explanation as to what might have happened, I'd love to hear it. Thank you for listening. My aunt told me this story. We are related by marriage, so she has a whole new set of skinwalker stories that I would like to share with you. This story took place when she was a child. My aunt's family lived in a community about 20 miles south of Gallup, New Mexico. The area is far different from where I live. My house is surrounded by desert, and you don't really see trees until you move into the canyon. Bread Springs is a forested area, and where our story takes place.
Like the view.
Like many people on the reservation, my aunt's family didn't have running water or electricity, so in order to have water, they would have to drive into town and haul water back in large containers. The containers are huge and easily fit in the bed of the truck. Her family would place 2 containers on a long flatbed trailer to make the best of each trip. Her family went into Gallup, filled up the containers, and went into town to do other types of business. Back then, seatbelt laws weren't so strict, and so my aunt and her siblings sat in the bed of the trucks as they went around town. It began to get dark, and so the family started to go back home. Most roads weren't paved, so they had to drive carefully because of the attached trailer. The lights of the town faded away in the distance, and soon the vehicle was surrounded by darkness. They drove, and the kids sat in the back and talked amongst themselves. That was until my aunt noticed something. A figure was crouched by the farthest water container on the flatbed. The truck wasn't barreling down the road, but it was going at a speed that it would be impossible for someone to run and jump on. My aunt nudged her siblings, and they all paused to look at the dark figure. They sat silently and squinted their eyes to look. It was too dark to really make anything out, so they ignored her and continued to talk. My aunt kept her eye on the figure and pulled hard on the sleeve of her brother when the figure began to crawl over to one of the water containers. The kids all stopped and watched in horror as the figure began to move carefully over the second.
Yeah, to tighten my
My aunt
pants.
said
They
the
were
figure looked like a person.
basically
However,
keep
the
falling
limbs
off.
weren't normally long. These long limbs pulled its body closer to the kids. At this point, they began to scream and cry. They banged on the window of the truck. At this time, the creature was reaching for the tailgate of the truck. Due to the huge commotion that was now going on in the bed of the truck, the driver slammed on the brakes. The creature hit the tailgate and fell down between the truck and the trailer. The driver rolled down the window and asked what was going on. The kids screamed at the driver to go. They weren't sure they were safe until they saw the trailer move up and down, as if it ran over something large. When my aunt told me this story, I sat in disbelief. She told me that she was uncomfortable when this thing was crawling on the trailer, but true fear rang through her body when she saw its eyes. I asked her what she meant. She said they were like teddy bear eyes. I didn't quite understand what that meant until I pressed further. She said the eyes were shiny. When you shine the light in the eyes of an animal, they reflect back. The brake lights were shiny, and whatever they saw that night had eyes that glowed back. My grandma was a practitioner of native medicine and ceremonies. She She was what the Navajo people call a crystal gazer. People would often come and visit her and ask her for healing or causes of their ailments. At times, people would ask her to help with protection from being attacked by evil entities. My grandma used to teach my...
On the afternoon of June 6th, 1980, a 56-year-old man named Zygmunt Adamski, who just went by Ziggy, was having a late lunch with his wife and his cousin inside of Ziggy's little brick house in the English village of Tingley. That day had been a particularly stressful day for Ziggy and his family because the following day was Ziggy's goddaughter's wedding, and Ziggy was very close with his goddaughter. Ziggy and his wife couldn't have kids because of medical issues, and so his goddaughter had basically become, at least in Ziggy's mind, like his own daughter. And so in fact, at her wedding, Ziggy was going to be walking her down the aisle. And while Ziggy was really excited about this, he was also very stressed out that he was going to screw it up. And so he had gone over and over, what responsibilities he had as part of the wedding party. And he had this little speech he had to give that he had rehearsed 50 times. He had it written out. I mean, he was ready, but he was very much in his own head about something potentially going wrong that he would be responsible for. And on top of that stress, Ziggy had gotten into a fight that day with his cousin because he felt like the cousin was being kind of disrespectful in some way to his goddaughter, and so Ziggy had stepped up and defended his goddaughter to his cousin, and so there was this undercurrent of tension at the lunch table, not to mention this overarching stress that Ziggy was under about this wedding. And so as Ziggy and his cousin and his wife have this kind of tense meal, Ziggy suddenly realizes that he forgot to get potatoes when he went to the store earlier to buy ingredients for this meal. And for some reason, Ziggy decides, you know what, I'm going to just put my stuff down now, go to the store, and get those potatoes, even though at this point it was too late to make the potatoes for the meal. And so maybe Ziggy just wanted to go out and do anything to get away from his cousin for a minute and away from all this wedding planning they were doing and just kind of go out and clear his head. And so Ziggy put his napkin down on the table, he stood up, he told his cousin and wife that he was going out to get potatoes. They were like, okay, and the cousin actually said, do you want me to come with you? Is there anything else you need to get while you're out? And Ziggy said, nope, I'm good. He grabbed some cash out of his wallet, and he headed out the door. The village of Tingley, where Ziggy and his wife lived, was a very safe place. He and his wife had actually moved there after fleeing from Poland during World War II, where both Ziggy and his wife, whose name was Lottie, had been held prisoner at some point. And so after all this trauma of being held prisoner and having to flee their home country, they had looked for the safest, best place to kind of resettle and stay for good, and Tingley was it, and they loved it. Ziggy had gotten a job in Tingley as a coal miner, and he had been doing that for 27 years. As for Lottie, she didn't work because she had a disease called multiple sclerosis, which meant she was confined to a wheelchair. But Ziggy and Lottie had quickly made lots of friends in town who were very supportive, and so it wasn't long before Ziggy and Lottie had a very happy and stable life in this town. The little shop where Ziggy was going to was only about 3 blocks away from his house, which meant walking to the store, getting potatoes, and coming back would only take a few minutes. And so Lottie and the cousin back home, they expected to see Ziggy really come back within 10-15 minutes. But when he didn't, and after about 30 minutes went by, Lottie actually got really concerned because Ziggy was just not the type of person to do stuff unannounced. He was incredibly methodical, he was very punctual and reliable, and so being late from this little trip to the store was just so uncharacteristic that Lottie told the cousin, hey, you go to the store and see if Ziggy is there. See what's going on here. Ziggy had worked in the coal mine for nearly 30 years, and he had some serious lung issues from breathing in all of the coal. And so Lottie was thinking, maybe he collapsed or something along the way from these breathing issues. But when the cousin got to the shop owner told the cousin that they had seen Ziggy. He had come in about 25 minutes earlier. He had bought a bag of potatoes, seemed totally normal, everything was fine, and he had left, walking back in the direction of his home. And so the cousin thanked the shopkeeper and then left and began jogging back towards Ziggy's house, thinking, maybe he had just not seen him on the way, that maybe Ziggy was sitting down somewhere on this 3-block path.
The thing about this trail is there's so many freaking rocks.
Any sign of Ziggy. And so after going back inside of the house, the cousin and Lottie talked about what they should do, and they actually went back out into the neighborhood, asking around, asking neighbors and other people if they had seen Ziggy. But after a couple of hours of canvassing the neighborhood and not finding Ziggy or finding any indication of what happened to him, Lottie ended up calling the police. But the police were not inclined to launch a huge investigation for a grown man who's only been missing for a couple of hours in his neighborhood with no sign of foul play or any other sign that anything really bad had happened. And after the police began asking questions of Lottie and the neighbors about what Ziggy's life was like, they learned that recently Ziggy had been declined for an early retirement from the coal mine. Because of those breathing issues he was having, he had requested to retire now, but they said no. And so Ziggy was really upset about that. He was really stressed about this wedding of his goddaughter the next day. He'd been fighting with his cousin. Also, Ziggy was basically taking care of his wife, who's in this wheelchair all the time. And so because of all these stressors in Ziggy's life, the police started to wonder if maybe it was possible that Ziggy had not been going to get potatoes, but in fact was just kind of abandoning his family. And so ultimately, on the day that Ziggy went missing, the police told Lottie and Ziggy's cousin that they should just sit tight, see if he comes back tonight, and if he doesn't, go to the wedding tomorrow, because Ziggy is so close with the goddaughter. If he's having some sort of issue right now, he's very likely to come back for something as significant as this wedding. And so Lottie and Ziggy's cousin stayed at the house all night. Ziggy did not come back. They didn't hear from him. And the next day they went to the wedding, but Ziggy didn't show up for that either, even though he's supposed to walk his goddaughter down the aisle. And so after coming back from this wedding, Lottie called the police, she called local hospitals, she talked to all of her neighbors. I mean, she really put out like an all-points bulletin to everybody in the area that something terrible has happened to Ziggy and we need to find him. But despite police beginning to lean into this and her neighbors really going out in force to try to find Ziggy, no one could find him. He had just vanished. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. Back in 2017, when I left the military, I really struggled to reintegrate back into society. But ironically, I didn't know I was struggling. I just assumed that the random bouts of anger and frustration and general dysphoria that I was feeling all the time were totally normal, and everybody else was dealing who will listen. And this big open lot that had a chain link fence around it that butted up against some railroad tracks. And inside of this lot were just these huge mounds of coal up against the perimeter of the lot. And then also inside of the coal yard was one small office building. And so on this morning, when Trevor pulled through the gates of this coal yard, first of all, he could see the entire yard the second he went in. And as he looked out, all he noticed was the fact that everything was wet from an early morning storm. And so after just kind of surveying around the lot to make sure none of the coal got blown around from the storm, he made his way to the small office building to do some paperwork. Trevor would work inside of that office building for a while, and then around lunchtime, Trevor decided to just go and get some lunch and kind of have a nice long lunch break. And so he left, he went to the pub, he was there for a couple of hours, and then around 3:45 p.m., he came back to the coal yard, and when he went through the gates, everything looked the same, except there was this dark thing on top of one of the coal piles in the back of the yard. Now, Trevor didn't know if he had seen it when he had first arrived that morning, or if it was new, but whatever it was on this pile, it immediately caught Trevor's attention. And so after parking his vehicle, Trevor began walking over to this 12-foot-tall coal pile with this thing on it, and when he got about 30 feet away from it, he realized he saw someone's shoe, that this dark figure was a person, and right away Trevor started rolling his eyes because there was a group of homeless people that lived near the railroad tracks just outside the coal yard, and it wasn't uncommon for them to get really drunk and then wander their way into the coal yard where sometimes they would fall asleep. And so Trevor's thinking, okay, clearly one of these drunk homeless people has found their way into the coal yard and they've passed out on top of this pile of coal. And so instead of going over and talking to this person directly, Trevor just turned around, went back inside of the office building, and he called for an ambulance. The ambulance arrived a few minutes later. They did not have their sirens on. They didn't come flying into the yard. This was a routine thing they were doing. They were scooping up a drunk and bringing them back to the hospital. And so when the medics got out of their ambulance and Trevor directed them over to the proper coal pile, they were just cracking jokes along the way. This was not a big deal. When the two medics got to the bottom of the coal pile, one of them began climbing up the coal to go see this drunk person and get them down. And so Trevor, as this is happening, he walked a little bit closer, and when he did, he realized that the person who had fallen asleep on the coal, they had really nice pants on, like tailored pants. They were certainly not what Trevor expected this person to be wearing. But before Trevor could even really react to the clothes this person had on, the medic who had climbed up had finally reached this person. They reached down and began trying to move the person around. And suddenly, when they had manipulated this person's body enough, the medic's facial expression completely changed. They went from somewhat routine to totally horrified. And they backed off of this person on the coals. They turned around and ran down the coal, practically falling over themselves. And when they got down there, Trevor heard the medic say to his partner, "Call the police right now." And Trevor said, "What's going on? What did you see?" And the medic, who had reacted that way, just shook his head and walked away to kind of compose himself. And so Trevor, at this point, was starting to get spooked himself. Clearly, whatever the medic had just seen had really shaken him up. And so Trevor just kind of stood there while the other medic ran in and called police. And then a few minutes later, a police car came flying into the coal yard, and an officer named Alan Godfrey, along with his partner, got out of the car, and right away the medic, who had gone to the top of the pile and been freaked out by what he saw, walked over with a very ashen face, and he told Alan Godfrey that something was terribly wrong with the person on top of this pile. And so Alan, not really sure what to expect, walked over with his partner to this coal pile, and with the medics and Trevor standing back, Alan, on his own, climbed up the coal, and he looked down at this person. And what Alan saw was a man lying on his stomach, wearing a beautiful three-piece brown suit, and Alan immediately noticed that there was absolutely no soot from the coal that this guy was laying on his suit, even though Alan, just to get up here, had basically covered himself in black soot. And so he was wondering, how did this guy get up here and not get covered in soot? It didn't make any sense. Also, Alan noticed that this guy's hair looked totally bizarre. It looked like someone had given him like a really bad haircut with dull scissors. Like they just grabbed tufts of his hair and kind of chopped randomly. I mean, his hair was kind of all over the place. There were bald spots. And then as Alan looked from this guy's hair down, he noticed almost hidden in his hairline was this fairly deep wound in the back of his neck that was still bleeding, but there was this weird green jelly-like substance very obviously placed over this wound. And Alan had no idea what this substance was. But as weird as all that was, that didn't explain why the first medic had basically completely panicked and run away. When Alan tried to roll this guy over onto his back to try to wake him up and see if he was okay, he rolled him over, and Alan got a look at this guy's face. And immediately Alan let go of him and kind of had to step back for a second, because the guy's face was contorted in this frozen look of absolute terror. His jaw was open so wide, it was almost like his lower jaw was dislocated, and his teeth were baring, and his eyes were bulging out of his head. And so Alan quickly realized that obviously this was not just some drunk homeless person who passed out here. This was a dead person, and whatever happened to them must have been unbelievably terrifying to leave someone looking like that in their death pose. It would turn out this deceased man in the coal yard was Ziggy Adamski. But this did not solve the mystery of what happened to Ziggy 5 days earlier. In fact, his discovery really only created more questions. This town where this coal yard was, Todd Morden, was located 25 miles away from where Ziggy lived. And as far as anyone knew, Ziggy didn't know anybody in Todd Morden. So there was no reason for him to be there. And number two, when he had left to go get potatoes, he had been on foot. So did he walk 25 miles to this random town? Also, assuming he did just walk to this coal yard, this coal yard is a big, wide open lot that if you were standing anywhere near it, even outside the fence, you could look in and basically see the entire place. So it just seemed really unlikely that Ziggy could just walk into this very public open space and get to the top of one of these coal piles without somebody noticing him, whether that was Trevor or one of the other employees that were there, or one of the truck drivers that were in and out of there all the time, all day, doing deliveries, or the homeless people who were near the railroad tracks, or the people who rode the trains that passed by there every single day. I mean, there are a lot of eyes on this coal yard, but nobody saw Ziggy. It was like he just kind of appeared at the top of this pile. And again, even if Ziggy had managed to slip in and sneak to the top of this pile, why didn't he have soot from the coal all over his clothes? And if maybe he had been brought there, if someone had killed him and put him on this coal pile, there's even more reason he would have soot all over him, because they would have had to drag him up to the top of the pile. And even putting all of that aside, if someone really did kill Ziggy and they placed him on this pile, why? This is a very open public place. Someone is going to find him. You're going to get caught if you're the killer. And then, of course, there is the issue of what Ziggy was wearing. That brown three-piece suit he was wearing that had no soot on it, it wasn't his, and it wasn't put on right. The buttons were not lined up. It almost looked like somebody else who didn't know how to put a suit on had tried to dress Ziggy. And then Ziggy also did not have an undershirt on. It was just the jacket over his skin. And then also Ziggy had this totally bizarre haircut that looked like someone who didn't know how to give a haircut had cut his hair with scissors and said, good enough. And then, of course, you have this wound on the back of Ziggy's neck. Now, the wound itself was determined not to be fatal. It was a fairly deep cut, but it wouldn't have killed him. However, the most significant part of that wound was that green jelly that had been placed across the back of it. During Ziggy's autopsy, they were unable to figure out what this green jelly was, and they ran dozens and dozens of tests on it. And also, during the autopsy, the coroner would determine that Ziggy had actually died the same day he had been found. So he was doing something for 5 days between going missing and being on this coal pile, but nobody knows what it was. And as for his cause of death, the coroner was not entirely sure, but it did seem like he died of a heart attack. The coroner would search all of Ziggy's body for signs of some sort of fight he might have gotten into, some sort of defensive wound on his body, but there was nothing. However, the coroner did find there were very small burns on the back of his neck that were caused by acid, but it was unclear how those got there. When they inspected Ziggy's stomach, they determined that he had been eating and drinking regularly, and so he was not malnourished, he was not dehydrated. He was relatively healthy when he died. He just had this heart attack for unknown reasons, and apparently whatever gave him the heart attack scared him so badly, his face contorted in that horrible way. Ultimately, the coroner just kind of gave up and ruled that Ziggy had died of natural causes, and then the case was closed. But to this day, no one really has any idea how Ziggy went from going out to get groceries to winding up 25 miles away, dressed differently, with this haircut, with this jelly on him and acid burns, dead with this horrible look on his face on this coal pile. It doesn't make any sense. This case has become very famous because people say it is the best example of alien abduction. That Ziggy had left his house to get groceries, got abducted by aliens, and then over 5 days, these aliens did stuff to Ziggy, including cutting into his neck and dropping acid on him, and then they put that green stuff on the back of his neck. They dressed him the way they thought people dressed, in a suit, but they didn't really do it right, and then they literally just dropped him on top of this coal pile, which would explain why he didn't have soot all over him. He was dead, they dropped him, and he just landed on the top of the coal pile. And even if you think that's totally far-fetched, keep in mind, still today, we do not know what that green jelly compound was on the back of his neck. It's literally never been identified, and people have been trying to figure it out for 40-plus years. Also, it's worth noting that one of the responding police officers, Alan Godfrey, claimed to have seen a UFO within weeks of finding Ziggy Adamski. On the evening of June 17, 2004, a 21-year-old woman named Molly Daniels pulled into the driveway of her little home that she shared with her husband and 2 kids in suburban Texas. It had been a long day for Molly at the home remodeling business where she worked as a receptionist, and so now that she was home, the last thing she wanted to do was go inside and make dinner for her family. And so, after turning off her car, Molly just sat there in the driveway for a couple of minutes, just zoned out looking out the window. But eventually, she kind of snapped out of it, she gathered up her things, she got out of the car, and she made her way up to the front door. And as soon as she stepped into her home, that bad mood she was feeling from work was wiped away and replaced with happiness. Because the first thing she heard the second she was in her home was the sound of her 4-year-old son, Caleb, hysterically laughing. And so Molly walked into the back room and she found her son, along with her husband, Clay, rolling around on the ground, tickling each other. And next to them was their 1-year-old daughter sitting on the rug, laughing as well and clapping and watching along. And so as soon as Molly walked into the room, Clay, who was underneath Caleb, stopped for a second and grinned up at Molly. Molly smiled back, and then Clay and Caleb went back to wrestling, and the 1-year-old continued to laugh and play along. And so Molly suddenly felt so content with her life. It was so incredible to have a family of her own. And so, with a big smile on her face now, she headed off into the kitchen to make dinner. Life had been tough financially for the Daniels family recently. The city where they lived, called Leander, was located just north of Austin, Texas, and it was getting more and more expensive every single year. Clay, who was 2 years older than Molly, he was 23, he was a mechanic, but he'd been out of work for months, and so he had just been staying home with the kids. As for Molly, she had her job as a receptionist, but it paid very little, and so ultimately the family was just barely scraping by. But despite the financial hardship they were under, Molly was so thankful that she had a husband in Clay that was so good with their kids, especially Caleb, the 4-year-old son, because Caleb was actually Molly's son from a previous relationship, and she was worried that maybe Clay wouldn't necessarily treat him like his own, but Clay had totally stepped up to the plate and become Caleb's father, and Caleb definitely viewed Clay as his dad, and so that relationship was as close as if they were biologically related, and so Molly just felt so grateful for that. That evening, the family sat down and had dinner together, and then afterwards, Molly and Clay got the kids off to bed, and then Molly and Clay stayed up and watched TV together. But after a while, Molly said she was tired and she was going to go to bed. Clay said he'd be staying up for a bit longer, and so the couple kissed, said goodnight, and Molly made her way upstairs. At around 10:45 p.m. that night, so about 15 minutes after Molly went upstairs, she was laying in bed, drifting off to sleep, when she heard the sound of their front door open and then shut, and then she heard the sound of their car being turned on and leaving the driveway. Now, this was not a big deal for Molly because earlier that night, Clay had mentioned kind of offhandedly that he wanted to go see his mom that night, that he might swing over there and say hello. He had a couple of paperback books that he wanted to give her, and so Molly knew there was a chance he could be doing that, and so she assumed that had to be what she was hearing, and so she forgot about it and fell asleep. The next morning, when Molly woke up at 6 a.m., she rolled over and she saw Clay was not in bed with her. Now, she wasn't immediately alarmed by this because it wasn't unusual for Clay to get up really early. And so Molly climbed out of bed, she made her way over to the window, and she looked down at the driveway, expecting to see their car back, meaning Clay would be downstairs somewhere. But she looked in the driveway, there was no car. And so suddenly feeling kind of panicked, Molly went downstairs and looked around the house. Clay wasn't there, and so she picked up the phone and she called Clay's mother. And when Clay's mother picked up, Molly said, "Hey, is Clay with you? He said he was stopping by last night. I heard him leave. Is he with you?" And Clay's mother would say, "No, he's not here. And in fact, I didn't even know he was going to be stopping by last night. I haven't heard from him." The drive from Molly and Clay's house to Clay's mother's house was 40 miles of twisting, fairly dangerous highway. Now, Clay regularly made this trip to and from his mother's house, and so Molly was never that worried about him going on this 40-mile stretch. But suddenly, without saying it, both Molly and Clay's mother were thinking the same thing. Did Clay get into a car accident last night on the drive to his mother's house? And so at some point, Clay's mom on the phone tells Molly to stay calm, stay at the house with your kids. I'm going to get in the car, I'm going to drive the route that Clay would have taken back to you, and we'll see if we can find him. And then as soon as the two women hung up, Clay's mother ran to her car, she jumped inside, she turned it on, she peeled out of the driveway, and began speeding those 40 miles back towards Clay and Molly's house. And she had only gotten about halfway along this trip when up ahead she saw all these flashing blue and white lights. She saw crime scene tape across the whole road. This was a section of the highway that was heavily forested on either side, and she could see traffic was backed up very far on the other end and as well on her side. And so of course Clay's mother is thinking, this is my son, he's been in an accident right here. And so she pulls over to the side of the road, she throws it in park, she gets out and runs to the nearest police officer and begins frantically asking them, what's happened here, what's happened? And as she's talking to the officer, she notices behind him there's all this smoke coming up from the forest. There's a fire down in the forest. And so she's craning her neck to look down and see what it is, and the officer tried to stop her, but finally she pushed past him and she looked and she saw there was a car on fire that clearly had flown off the road. And so in a total panic, she begins asking the officer, do you know who it is? Is it my son? Is it Clay? The officer told her to please calm down. We have no idea whose car this is. We're trying to figure it out. The fire department hasn't even put the fire out yet. We don't know enough to tell you anything. But at this point, Clay's mother could not wait any longer for answers. And so she turned around, she ran back to her car, she hopped in it, and she made her way around this big police barricade and sped the rest of the way to Clay and Molly's house. And there, she picked up Molly, she drove her back, and when they got there, both women are totally hysterical, but they run right up to the police tape, and they look down in the direction of where the fire had been, which now had been put out. There was just smoke coming off of this car frame that had been totally burned out. And immediately, when Molly looked down there, she recognized the car. Or I should say, she recognized the shape of the car, because the fire had totally eviscerated the car. But Molly, she was seeing the frame was about the right size, and she was seeing that strewn around this burned out car were all these paperback books that had been burned up partially in this fire. And she knew that Clay had likely been on his way to his mother's house with all these paperback books inside of his vehicle. And so she knew this had to be Clay. And at the same time that Molly is having this horrible realization, the fire department down below was able to actually get into the burned out vehicle. They opened up the door and they found right away there was a body in the driver's seat. So between the size of the body, all the paperback books that Molly said, that would be something Clay would have, along with several other personal effects that were found inside of the car, like Clay's prized Harley-Davidson pin that he always wore in his hat, it was obvious that this was Clay. When word spread about Clay's death, Molly's neighbors and friends in Leander jumped into action. People loved Molly in Leander. She was this very sweet, very kind woman who was a little bit socially awkward, but they had found, ever since she had married Clay, she had really found some more confidence and just seemed happier. And so it was totally devastating to see Clay be pulled from her life like that. And so very quickly, the community in Leander raised $1,000 and they gave it to Molly and her kids. And then also neighbors began dropping off food and stocking their fridge with groceries. And even though Molly couldn't even eat, she was so grief-stricken from the loss of Clay, she still very much appreciated the effort that people were making to comfort her. But as the community rallied around Molly and her kids to get them through this difficult time, the police were starting to ask some questions about how exactly this crash that had killed Clay actually happened. Because there were some oddities about the scene of the accident. The biggest being, there were no skid marks on the road, which meant Clay had not hit the brakes before swerving off the road and crashing down in the trees below. And secondly, they didn't really understand how the fire that had started after this crash had gotten so incredibly hot that it basically had completely melted away every part of the vehicle save for the frame. And also, Clay's body had been totally destroyed. I mean, the authorities had seen fires after car accidents, but nothing like this. This looked very unique. And so investigators started to wonder if they were really dealing with a car accident, or if this was a murder. And on June 22nd, just 4 days after Clay was found, investigators would learn from the crime lab that their suspicions had been correct. We did a merch drop last year, and the gear was awesome. We were so happy with it, but the shipping times were ridiculously long. We had big shipping issues. We actually had to shut down that merch drop early to deal with those issues. Well, we fixed those issues, and so shipping will no longer be an issue for us now or in the future. And so, as a token of our appreciation for you all in putting up with the shipping issues in the first drop, we've decided to do a massive sale. For context, she had not served yet, and probation. Now, the father of the victim, the 7-year-old girl, was absolutely furious about Clay's life sentence. And in fact, just a couple of days before Clay died, the father threatened to kill Clay. So, investigators quickly tracked down this father, and they brought him in for questioning. But very quickly, this father made it clear to police that yes, he hated Clay. Yes, he had threatened to kill Clay, but no, he had nothing to do with what happened to Clay. And the father had an alibi to back that up. And so, after confirming his alibi, the police somewhat reluctantly allowed the father to leave, even though to a lot of them, he just really seemed like the slam dunk primary suspect, but he couldn't have been. And so with him out of the picture, the police were kind of back to the drawing board. And so they decided they would actually go talk to Molly and see if maybe she could shed some light on who else might have wanted to hurt Clay. Now, in their previous conversations with Molly, police found her to be incredibly polite and also at the same time very, very upset about the death of her husband. But this time, when investigators showed up at Molly's house and she brought them into her kitchen where they sat down to talk, it was like the police got a totally different Molly. And it happened as soon as they asked her, hey, who do you think could have hurt your husband? It was like Molly suddenly became impatient. She didn't have time for these questions. And finally, she just said, you know what? I think Clay was depressed because he had that prison sentence that was coming up that he didn't want to serve. And so probably he just killed himself. I think that's what happened. And so now I need you guys to leave. And so the officers didn't make a fuss. They didn't fight Molly on this. They just got up, they left. But once they were back out in their car, they looked at each other and they both agreed that Molly's behavior was very suspicious, and it made them think, maybe she actually knows more about what happened to Clay, and she's kind of trying to cover it up and make the police go away. And over the next couple of weeks, as police began investigating Molly, they discovered quite a bit of evidence that made them even more suspicious of her. For one thing, there was Clay's $110,000 life insurance policy that Molly was entitled to, and Molly had apparently been calling the insurance company nearly non-stop every day, trying to get them to wire that payment as soon as possible. And Molly apparently was telling people in town how excited she was about getting that money. Also, police learned, after talking to Molly's neighbors, that Molly was starting to date again already. Just 3 weeks after her husband had died, she's out there on the dating scene, even bringing home one of her boyfriends and having him live with her 2 kids. And according to Molly's babysitter, this new boyfriend that was coming into the house was really upsetting Caleb, the 4-year-old, who had been so close with Clay. The babysitter would say that Caleb, who normally was a very mellow child back when Clay was still alive, was now very violent and emotional, and periodically he would just stop, look up into the sky, and scream, "I love you, Daddy." But when the babysitter brought this up to Molly and said, really, you should get your son some help here, Molly got angry and said Caleb was fine, it was none of her business, and then she slammed the door on the babysitter. But despite how suspicious Molly now seemed, there wasn't any real evidence that actually linked her to Clay's death. And so finally, in the fall of 2004, so several months after Clay's death, and still the police have not figured out who killed him or how he died and how he wound up in this inferno by the side of the road, they decided to kind of reinvigorate this investigation into Molly. They really wanted to find evidence that she was involved in Clay's death. And so they decided to put a surveillance team on Molly 24/7. And at first, the undercover police would report that Molly's behavior was incredibly routine. She basically did the same things every single day. She got up, she got the kids out the door, she went to work. Afterwards, she picked her kids up from the babysitter, she went home, she fed her kids, and then they all went to bed, and they did it all again the next day. The only deviation from her schedule was periodically she would go out after work to run some errands, like go to the grocery store. But then, on December 3rd, so 6 months after Clay was found, Molly would finally break her routine. On that day, Molly, on her way home from work, made a pit stop in this parking lot near several local stores. So she parked her car, she got out, but then instead of walking into one of these stores to run an errand or something, she walked to a dark-colored Mustang that was parked in the parking lot as well, and a guy was driving it. This guy the cop didn't recognize, with dark hair. Molly walked up to him and began talking to this guy through the window, and then at some point, Molly began very suspiciously looking over her shoulder like she was trying to see if anyone was watching her. And then she walked around and climbed into the Mustang with this guy. She shut the door, and then the two of them drove off together. And so the undercover police officer followed after them. And eventually, the Mustang containing Molly and this guy pulled into the parking lot of a Taco Bell, a fast food restaurant. And so they stopped, they got out, and the undercover officer watched as the two of them casually walked inside of the Taco Bell. They ordered some food, and they sat down by the window to eat. And so by this point, the undercover officer, he's not seeing anything incriminating happening here, but what he's seeing is such a break from her routine that it just seemed really suspicious, and he wanted to go inside and have a look. And so he called for backup from another undercover officer who was part of the surveillance team. He came into the parking lot, and then the two of them, these two officers who are wearing plain civilian clothes, they both got out of their unmarked vehicles, and they casually walked into the Taco Bell, and they got in line to order food. And as they were standing in line, one of the undercover officers casually turned around in line and very nonchalantly scanned the room, like he was looking at nothing in particular. But in reality, what he was doing was taking a quick glimpse at Molly and this guy she was with. And when the officer took this quick glimpse, he noticed something very strange about the guy that Molly was sitting with. Something that the officer hadn't seen before, but now that he was up close, he could see it. And as soon as he saw this strange thing, the officer tapped on his partner's shoulder like, all right, we're doing something here. The officer reached down, put his hand on his concealed gun underneath his shirt, and then he walked across the restaurant, not even pretending to be undercover at this point. He's basically giving away that he's a cop. He strode right over to their table, and when he stopped in front of them, Molly and the guy she was with both looked up at him in surprise, and the officer just stared down at the guy, not at Molly, just at the guy. The strange thing the officer had caught when he looked over at the guy was that he recognized him. This was
We're walking like uphill.
Personally from being in law enforcement in the area.
Uphill.
This guy was Clay Daniels, Molly's supposedly dead husband. He had just clearly dyed his blonde hair black. It would turn out Molly and Clay had staged his death in order to keep him from having to serve that prison sentence for the sexual assault charge, and so they could collect on the $110,000 life insurance policy. The body that was found inside of the burned out car was obviously not Clay's. It was the body of an 81-year-old woman who Clay had dug up from some isolated cemetery, thrown inside of his vehicle, and then pushed his vehicle off the road and lit on fire with lighter fluid. And so that was why there was no skid marks up on the road, because again, this was not a car accident, it was staged. And so after Clay and Molly staged Clay's death, it actually worked. People really believed that Clay had died. Out the front door in the middle of the night with his shabby clothes on and headed to Brooklyn.
Alright, so you guys missed like 5-10 minutes. I'm gonna say 10, but it's basically been the same. But like I said earlier, I had a charge. I didn't bring extra batteries with me for the hike, so I had a charge with this little thing. And it's kind of working.
His father's old medical textbooks to try to find a cure for Homer's blindness caused by his stroke. And at some point, Langley believed he really had come across the cure. And the cure was basically for Homer to eat oranges. Lots and lots of oranges. And in fact, over the last several weeks before this night, Langley had already made this change in Homer's diet. He only fed him oranges for every single meal. He got them from this dumpster, and he fed them to Homer. And Homer, he too believed this cure was going to work, and so he ate the oranges without question. And so back on March 9th, after Langley had gathered up the oranges from inside this dumpster, slung it on his shoulder, and walked back to his mansion, He maneuvered his way through the crack in the front door because he was super skinny. He was able to barely get through. And then once he was inside the mansion and shut the door behind him, he maneuvered his way up to the second floor. And then he began the most dangerous part of his journey from one side of the second floor to the other where Homer was. Basically, Langley needed to crawl through a 2-foot wide tunnel he had built through all the junk and trash, but it was lined with booby traps. In particular, there was a nasty trap at the end of the tunnel where there was this stack of metal boxes filled with all these newspapers. They were really heavy, and they were positioned so if you even so much as barely touched the lowest box, they would come crashing down on you. Now, Langley had made this journey countless times. This is how he went to see his brother every single day, as he went through this tunnel. But on this day, as he low-crawled his way through the tight tunnel in the trash, he accidentally knocked the lowest metal box. The boxes tumbled down on him and pinned him to the ground. Now, these boxes were very heavy, but they were not heavy enough to kill someone. It would just pin them down. It would be impossible to get out from under them. So Langley, very likely, after getting trapped, called out for his brother, Homer, who was actually only 10 feet away from him. But Homer was blind, he was sick, he had absolutely no energy because all he ate was oranges and it was basically killing him. And so he couldn't even get out of his chair, let alone go save his brother. And so for several agonizing hours, Langley likely yelled for his brother until the weight of all these boxes did crush him to death. And then Homer was left all alone in this house where no one knew he needed help and no one could even get to him if they wanted to. And so he was doomed. And so for 2 weeks, Homer just sat in this chair, starving to death, while he likely listened to the sound of rats eating his brother's body. The big clue that the police found that broke this case wide open is they actually spotted Langley's white foot bone that had been picked clean by the rats jutting up out of this trash tunnel 10 feet away from Homer. When the police had first searched the mansion, it was so full of stuff that they never saw this bone. It just kind of blended in. But 18 days after finding Homer, they realized Langley was right there. There was a skeleton. As for the Charles Smith tipster that police thought had to be Langley calling in after he had murdered his brother, well, it wasn't Langley because Langley was dead at the time this tip came in. And so Charles Smith was a real person who very likely just walked past the mansion and he probably caught a whiff of the smell of rotting dead bodies, and so he called it in. 4 months after Homer and Langley were found dead inside of their maze of trash, their mansion was declared a fire hazard and demolished. Today, there is a small park called the Collier Brothers Park, and it's filled with nothing but a couple of trees and a bench. When I was a trainee park ranger up here in Washington, I used to patrol this one trail that was popular with some nearby college students. The campus was maybe only 30 or 40 minutes walk away from this particular trail, which was fairly short and set into the northeastern edge of the park, so some weekends the trail would be dotted with groups of students partaking in a little wholesome outdoor exercise. Occasionally you'd get a group doing something not so wholesome, either drinking or just making a general nuisance of themselves, but for the most part, the hikers among them tended to be polite and well-behaved. Although they didn't exactly run like clockwork, there was one particular time when the trail would almost always be completely deserted. Due to even the most studious college kids' propensity for drinking, Saturday mornings were, without a doubt, the quietest time of the week. On the rare occasion you did see anyone, it was usually someone a little older, sometimes a couple, but never anyone college-aged. So this one very early morning when I suddenly spot someone ahead of me on the trail that looked a lot like a college kid, it definitely raised an eyebrow. You might be wondering how someone looks like a college kid. Well, first-time hikers tend to look unprepared in both their equipment and their clothing. And this girl had no pack and wore something that looked better suited to a Friday night party than a Saturday morning's hike. She was also walking at a particularly slow pace, the kind of pace that says, I thought this was a good idea, but now I want to go home, which is very typical of first-time college-age hikers who bite off a little more than they can chew. She's walking so slowly that I start wondering if she's still drunk from the night before or something.
Every so often, she'd stumble or sway slightly, and this made me increasingly concerned as I caught up with her. I also happened to notice that her clothes looked pretty dirty, almost like she'd either fallen or had taken a dirt nap of some kind. It also looked like she was sweating a phenomenal amount. Her hair was wet and stringy, and there was a big dark patch around her back and shoulders where the fabric was clinging to her wet skin. She was obviously in a really bad way. I just had no idea how bad her condition actually was. When it got to the point where I was only about 10 to 15 feet behind her, she still hadn't turned around to notice me, and I knew just silently passing her might scare her half to death. So I figured I'd just wish her a good morning just to announce my presence. But as soon as I do that, the girl turns around, and I just about jump back in horror at what I saw. The girl had a horrific head wound above her eye, and the eye itself was so completely caked with blood that I'm not sure she could see out of it. Someone had seriously tried to cave this girl's head in, and the fact that she was still walking around seemed like nothing short of a miracle. As soon as she laid her one good eye on me, she just sort of collapsed down onto her butt, reaching up to me and croaking, "Water, water," over and over again. I rushed to give her some water, then radioed into HQ to get medical attention, but as I did so, a certain smell hit my nostrils. It was as intense as it was recognizable, and it suddenly hit me that whatever she'd been through was no accident. She wasn't soaked with sweat. Someone had poured gasoline on her. I kept asking her what had happened, but she couldn't seem to get any words out. She just kept drinking more and more water, then staring off into the distance like she was on the verge of going into shock. The only thing she said to me before passing out was, "My friend," which scared me, thinking that there were more kids hurt or dangers somewhere out there on the trail. I kept thinking that she was going to die right there on the trail with me, but she still had a pulse when a coworker with an ATV stretcher trailer showed up, and as far as I knew, she was still alive when the EMTs showed up to rush her to the hospital. Myself and the rest of the ranger team then spent the rest of the morning combing through the woods around the northeastern trail, looking for any signs of the poor girl's friends. All we found was a doused campfire with a few empty beer and liquor containers surrounding it, but the ranger who found it was quick to add that the place reeked of gasoline. We didn't get the full story until a week or so later, and knowing what actually happened to the girl made her only words to me, "my friends," seem all the more haunting. She wasn't saying it because she was worried about them. It was more a case of her asking why people she believed were her friends would do something so awful to her. Yep, there had been no ambush of some innocent college kids by some masked horror movie psycho. This girl's own friends had lured her out into the woods, beat her half to death, then tried to set her on fire. I found out later that the only thing that stopped them from actually lighting her on fire was that someone's lighter wasn't working. The group then tried to light a stick on fire using their campfire, but it was a slow process, and by the time they'd made themselves a torch, the victim had managed to run off into the woods and hide. She stayed put for a few hours, drifting in and out of consciousness, and finally got enough adrenaline going to try to make her way out of the woods. And that's when I found her. And knowing she'd get the help she needed, her body just shut down again. They attacked her over some stupid love triangle too, the ringleader having a crush on a guy who had a crush on the victim in turn. Jealousy boiled over, and I guess the alcohol fueled the violence, but a group of college kids legitimately conspired to burn one of their peers alive, all because of a teenage crush. That's the scariest thing in the world to me, and it's so utterly terrifying because I just can't understand it. The guilty parties all got arrested and kicked out of college, then most were handed lengthy prison sentences after a pretty well-publicized trial. My ranger team was glued to the radio during radio news breaks for 2 weeks, desperate for any news, and that's how we came to know the horrifying extent of what had occurred that night. The encounter that morning and the eventual discovery of what happened to that poor girl made for the more frightening and disturbing moments of my career. There are some real scary places out there in the woods, all right, but there's a kind of innocence to grizzlies and mountain lions. They'll kill you to survive, whereas people, on the other hand, people kill just to watch each other die. past 4 years or so, I've worked as a full-time park ranger for the British National Trust. Established almost 130 years ago, the National Trust is the largest heritage conservation society in the United Kingdom. And its job is to look after places of a historic significance or natural beauty across the country. This includes everything from old stately homes to national parks, and since I grew up in County Down here in Northern Ireland, my career as a park ranger inevitably saw me posted to the Mourne Mountains. The mountains encompass a few different forests and parks that come under the jurisdiction of the National Trust. Silent Valley, Tollymore, and Rostrevor, to name a few. But since they're all in an area that's only about 15 miles across, they're all under the remit of the team I'm a member of. I said I've been a ranger for 4 years, but I did my training around Mourne too, and since I was raised just north in Lurgan, I knew the area like the back of my hand by the time it came to my ranger promotion. My experience meant that team members would often come to me if they needed any expert advice on local terrain and navigation, which is how I ended up getting a phone call early one morning from a colleague who needed assistance. She'd had a call from someone she described as a very upset camper who had woken up at dawn to find a couple of dead sheep outside his tent. That's the phrase my colleagues used, a couple. And since sheep have a nasty habit of turning up dead for a multitude of reasons, I didn't think too much of it. As I might have touched on, the reason my colleague had asked for my help was because I'd have a much better chance than her of actually finding where the guy was camped. And as much as I was willing to lend a hand, I was curious as to why the camper couldn't just lead my colleague back to his camp. My colleague replied something to the effect of, "It's not that he can't go back, it's that he won't go back. Honestly, he seems terrified." This really piqued my interest because, although a few dead sheep definitely isn't the most pleasant thing to wake up to, I couldn't see how someone would be terrified of it. Then add the fact that they're too scared to even go back to their campsite to collect their belongings. As I said, it piqued my interest. From the fairly vague description I was given by my colleague, I was able to roughly pinpoint the area where the guy's camp had been. If he'd been pitched at a marked campsite, it would have been much easier to find and a much more public affair. But since he was wild camping, or rambling as some folks say, he basically pitched his tent in the middle of nowhere with very little to go on in terms of location aside from near such and such field. While out searching, I got my colleague on the phone again, who still had the terrified camper with them down at our Mourne Country Park office, and basically asked her to rinse the guy for information. According to him, after coming across the horrifying scene, he'd basically run all the way from his campsite to Mourne Country Park. He hadn't run all the way, and had slowed his pace when he felt that he put himself at a safe distance. And because it was so early in the morning, he'd had to walk past a few other homes and businesses before he saw anything that could help him. I asked why he hadn't just called someone from his campsite, but the camper repeated that he'd been terrified and hadn't bothered to grab anything before fleeing the area. At this point, as I'm driving around on speakerphone, I started wondering just how many dead sheep it takes to scare someone who was apparently well into middle age. I wasn't some scared kid my colleague had been there. He was older than me by the sounds of things. So I told my colleague to ask him exactly how many dead sheep had been outside his tent. The reply came back, "I don't know." The guy couldn't even guess. He only added, "It was a mess up there, and that I should take a gun of some kind with me if I'm the one investigating." I only overheard the last part, but my colleague didn't entertain the idea by repeating it to me. I don't know what it's like for park rangers over in America, but 99% of national park staff remain completely unarmed at all times and have absolutely no access to firearms of any kind. We just don't really need it. We don't have any kind of crazy wildlife that necessitates that kind of kit. So, some guy saying that I can take a gun with me sounded like
Not the greatest settings, but they're
I ended up talking to him
decent.
personally, and I got him to describe his campsite as best he could, painstaking details if possible. He tried his best,
Quality-wise.
but nothing seemed to click, until he mentioned how on his first day's walk he passed a large body of water that looked to be in a kind of C shape. The only large lake or reservoir in the Mournes shaped like that is the Spelga Dam, and with the camper saying that he pitched his tent only 5 to 10 minutes walk from the very obvious source of fresh water, that narrowed down my search area by quite a bit. Then, after playing a little mental game of where would I camp near Spelka, I decided to drive over to check out two distinct places with great cover and concealment. The first one was no good, but the second one was a bingo. I see a bright red tent sitting among some trees up ahead of me. The guy had chosen to camp among some trees, meaning I couldn't see much from a distance, dead sheep included. But after trudging across a muddy field and hopping a fence, I finally got a good look at what had scared the campers so much. And let me tell you, it put the fear of God into me too. From what I could gather, the reason why the man had been unable to give us an exact number of dead sheep is because there were bits and pieces of wool, flesh, and bone strewn all over his campsite. It was mind-bogglingly upsetting to look at. I'd never seen anything like it in all my life, let alone during the course of my ranger career. I had to count the sheep's skulls, or what I could at least guess were the remains of their skulls, to get an accurate number, and I counted 4 eviscerated sheep around that man's campsite. 4. There was little wonder he'd been so terrified, having a sight like that be the first thing greeting him in the morning. I'd consider myself quite hardy when it comes to things like that, but sweet baby Jesus, even I found myself shaken having come across that scene. As soon as I was able, I contacted another colleague of mine, told them exactly where the campsite was, and asked them to lock the place down so we could secure the scene. I know it seems a bit over the top going all CSI over a few sheep, but if something like that happens, we have to ensure there's some degree of evidence preservation so we can at least get an idea of what happened. Then, while they got with that, I intended to drive over to Morin Country House to have a chat with our frightened camper. I had a number of questions for him, things I wanted to hear with my own ears and not via my colleague over the phone. When I arrived, the guy was still quite shaken up, sitting in the little porta-cabin in the car park that serves as the National Trust office for Morin Country House. My colleague, Jane, had already given him about 3 or 4 cups of tea, and was only happy to make me one too before I got to asking my questions. They were irrelevant, really. I was confident we'd find out everything we needed to know from the scene, but I was very curious as to how the guy didn't wake up during the night. Obviously, he didn't have much of an answer for me. I asked him if he was a heavy sleeper, and he said he didn't think so. Then added that he believed someone had dumped the sheep's remains there as a kind of warning. I asked him if he'd angered or annoyed anyone during his trip, but again, he said he didn't think so. It was definitely curious, but the guy was being of very little help, so I thought I'd just crack on with the next task at hand, which was trying to find out which farmer had 4 sheep missing. It was still very much a possibility that the 4 sheep had managed to break out of a pen somewhere, went on the run, and then got attacked by a dog or a pair of foxes. Stranger things than that have happened round Moor, I can assure you, but few things as strange as what I was dealing with that day. We quickly found the farm which all 4 missing sheep had come from, so I drove over to have a word with the farmer and to have a check on his fences. And this is where the story starts to get really weird. We were already at weird with the dead sheep right next to the camp, but this next part catapulted the situation way past a head-scratcher and into territory which was downright unsettling to me. The farmer in question told me that 4 sheep had indeed gone missing from his farm, only they'd done so
At
over the
least
past
with this
2 weeks,
trail, it's like
one going missing
straight.
every
You don't
couple of
have to
nights.
go up and down a
What's
bunch
more,
of hills.
the farmer was only too happy
It's
for me to
just
inspect his fences for
pretty
him.
even,
He'd
so
been up
it's
the wall with them for weeks,
pretty
to
chill.
work out where the sheep were getting out.
You don't like
I could hardly claim to be an
overly
expert on the
exert
matter, but I
yourself,
gave his fences a check
so you
anyway,
can walk a
just
lot
like he
farther.
said, he turned the place into a bloody fortress of wood stakes and chicken wire. The farmer himself then told me that he was convinced someone was stealing a sheep somehow. A sheep going
But see, like,
missing.
this isn't even
Irritatingly
the
common
Appalachian
occurrence,
Trail, and it has like a
and 4 sheep
different
going
feel
missing
to
over the
it
course of 2
than the
weeks,
Appalachian Trail,
turning up
and
dead
it's
and
like
slashed up in the exact
right
same
next to
place.
each other.
Something was obviously going on, but sadly, it was something we never got to the bottom of. The scene was cleared up, with a
I saw
wildlife
something
expert
back
stopping
there,
by
like
to
a
tell
building,
us that
but
the wounds
yeah,
to the sheep were in
it's
too
like
bad of a condition to properly analyze.
bushes.
We'd never know if it was an animal or a person that had done those horrible things. Just one of the many things that continues to bother me all these years later. When the farmer heard exactly how his sheep had died, he pressed for us to investigate the camper for animal cruelty. His assertions are reasonable in many ways, but 4 dead sheep don't really make it big on the local police's radar, and we had no idea where the camper went after that, so there was no arresting or questioning him. Besides, the PSNI have got enough on their plate without investigating bloody sheep murders, and the only papers it's got more than a few lines in was a bloody regional farmer's monthly that put it down to foxes or stray dogs. It was baffling to me. There was obviously something more to the whole thing, yet everyone but me and a handful of my colleagues either didn't know enough or didn't care enough to actually look into it properly. All the higher-ups wanted to do was chalk it up to a spike in the local fox population, but no one who'd actually witnessed the carnage up at that campsite could possibly claim that foxes did that. The only real feedback or reaction we got from the National Trust or the RSPB was to keep an eye out for any large escaped dogs and other such predators. We all found that last part a wee bit ominous, but it was ultimately inconsequential. There was no hound of the Baskervilles-type creature roaming the Mourne Mountains, but no formal investigation helped us figure out what actually happened.
This thing.
Of all the things that I've seen or experienced during my time working for the National Trust, the incident with the dead sheep is the one thing that still sends shivers down my spine whenever I think about it.
It's pretty good.
But it's not what I know about
Not
it
as
that
good
scares
as the
me.
E-juice.
It's what I don't know that keeps me up
Like,
at
I
night
prefer
sometimes.
getting the liquid.
In all these years,
But
later.
it's pretty good.
Hello, Let's Read. My name is Radim, and I am what you might call a park ranger here in my home country, Slovakia. I'm writing to you because I want to explain to you something that is happening in my country, and it is happening in one particular area in Slovakia. For some backstory, Slovakia is a country in the middle of Europe. The biggest mountains here are the Carpathian Mountains, and Tribec is part of the Carpathian Mountains. Tribec is a relatively small and not very high mountains in the shape of a triangle and is located in the west side of the country. There are some very dangerous tall mountains here in Slovakia, like the Tatras Mountains, and these are dangerous because of bad weather and rock slides and wild animals. Tribec is not like that. The climate is moderate, no tornadoes, no earthquakes. It just looks like a calm, normal place. But it's not calm, and it's not normal. For some, Tribec is a very dangerous place. There is a whole series of missing people in Tribec, people whose bodies have never been found. I believe that most of them could be explained as tragic accidents when animals attack the victim, preventing the body from being found. But there are other cases when things are not so easily explained. The Tribec disappearances have become a sort of meme or urban legend here in Slovakia, almost like the Bermuda Triangle. The disappearances are real, but no one seems to take them seriously anymore. The stranger ones happen so far apart in time that people don't become alarmed. They just shrug their shoulders and say, "Oh well, at least it wasn't me." I made a list of some such cases, and I'd like to know your thoughts on them because I think something very frightening is happening here. All the way back in 1929, a man named Mr. A. Simsali went missing on a snowy November day. He just told a neighbor that he wanted to go for a walk and then never came back. The heavy snows made it impossible to search for him properly until the springtime, but by then, it was too late. He had completely disappeared and no dead body was ever recovered. Some say that the man took his own life, as he had a very lonely life with no wife or children, but all agree that the fact that he was never found is very strange because Tribec is so small. Then, in 1939, a man named Walter Fisher went missing. Walter worked in a shoe factory in a small city called Partizanski, on the west of the Tribec Mountains. He worked there for 6 days every week, then, on Sundays, he would visit his wife and children who still lived out in the countryside because they couldn't afford to live in the city. On Sunday of January of 1939, he decided that for some reason he wouldn't visit his family, but rather go for a hike in the forest around Tribec. According to one of his co-workers, Walter had mentioned that he wanted to visit a place called the Čierny hrad, which literally means the Black Castle in Slovakia. It is a ruined fortress from many hundreds of years ago, which was built to protect against Hungarian raiders. Some tourists occasionally visit the place, but I don't understand why Walter would make it the destination of his hike. The Black Castle is 25 kilometers from Partizanski, meaning Walter would had to have walked 50 kilometers if he wanted to make it back to his lodgings in time for work the next day. This is not my idea of what a hard-working man like Walter would do on his day off to relax. Rather, it sounds like he had some kind of business at the Black Castle, like he had planned to meet someone there or something like that. It also doesn't make sense that he would choose to go on such a hike in January when the snows make it very, very difficult to move around on foot. Sometime later, Walter's wife reported him missing, and he remained a missing person for months and months. Then in May of that same year, Walter Fisher suddenly showed up alive. No one knows what happened to him or where he'd been, but it was clear that in the time that he'd been missing, something terrible had happened to him. When he was found, he was in the middle of a field more than 30 kilometers away from Partizanski, the place that he was last seen, on the complete opposite sides of the Trebetch Mountains. His clothes were in rags, he was unconscious, and there were reports of him being horribly wounded. Some accounts say the wounds were burns and others say cuts, but it's clear that he was taken to a hospital where he stayed for a long time. Walter said that he had no memory of the time that he was missing, but was traumatized and spent the rest of his life in a hospital for people with psychological problems. So what in God's name happened to him in the months he was missing? There are many, many theories on this, some quite believable and some wild and crazy. Most of them involve World War II and how tensions in the run-up to the war led to Walter being accused of being a spy. This would explain why he was wounded but not killed. Someone had been hurting him but also feeding him. Then there are all the theories involving time portals, other dimensions, aliens, or UFOs. These are not things that I believe, so I won't go into them, but the lack of any real answers has led to such fantasies. Personally, I have no idea what exactly happened to Walter, but it was clearly something very, very frightening. Now, the next mysterious disappearance involved a husband and wife in 1966. Their names were Jan and Elena, and in February of 1966, they drove to the city of Jelinek, parked their car near the forest, then apparently went off hiking together. Their car was fine. Their friends and family didn't notice anything odd about the way that they were acting before that day either. But still, just like the others, Jan and Elena walked into the forest of the Trebetch Mountains and were never seen again. Their case seems to have gotten a lot more attention from newspapers, and I read that the whole of Slovakia searched far and wide for the couple. But according to one policeman, it was like they just stepped out of their car, walked into the woods, and completely disappeared. Anyone who knows these particular cases finds them completely baffling. Like I said, there have been many other people go missing in the Trebetch, but because it is so small, they get found about 99% of the time with an injury or they got lost. A totally normal explanation. But to have these people just completely disappear and the one to suddenly show up with no memory and strange wounds, it's enough to make the rational people like me wonder what is reality and what's science fiction. It's also very frustrating for me because not a lot of people outside of Slovakia know about the Trebetch missing people. And those that do assume that they're just campfire stories because of the Slovak shrug-shoulders attitude to them. I'm sure there is a normal explanation for what has happened to these people, but I cannot see it, and that's why I'm trying to get this story to as many English language media as I can. Maybe if enough light is shed on it, the mystery will finally be solved. Many years ago now, I used to work up in Alaska as a member of the Park Services. One day we had gotten a call about some illegal dumping on one of the local trails, so myself and another employee went out to check it out. We were fairly deep into the trails, not too many people around except for a few joggers, when we came around to turn on the path. As we were walking, my partner looked into the woods and said, "What in the world? There's a guy there." About 20 yards away, there was a white guy with longish hair crouched behind a bush, just kind of staring at us. The man noticed that we had noticed him, and he immediately stood up and stretched out his arms in the air, like he was just enjoying the day. He actually approached us, and it turns out the man that I was with actually knew the man in the woods. He was a local builder or owned a construction company. In fact, he had built a deck for my friend a year prior. After they said their hellos, he mentioned that he just stepped off the path for a moment to take a leak. It was kind of strange, though, because we had seen him, and that definitely wasn't what he was doing. But he wasn't that suspicious, and my friend knew him, so after making sure that he wasn't illegally dumping or anything of that nature, we just started walking back, and he walked with us for a fair while. A few years later, I heard that the man that we had seen had been arrested. Apparently, there had been some sort of altercation with a girl at a coffee shop, or so I had initially been told, and he had shot her in a robbery and was under arrest for murder. The truth was even more bizarre. The man, Israel Keys, was a serial killer who had actually abducted, tortured, and murdered the girl. After being arrested, it turns out that he had been traveling around the country murdering people randomly for years. He would bury murder kits and come back sometimes years later to dig them up, and they would include guns, cash, etc., and whatever he needed. I went back later to where we had come across Israel in the woods to see if there was any such a kit buried there, but I didn't find anything. Others suggested that he might have been waiting to surprise a victim on the trail, but that didn't seem to be his general MO, as was my understanding. Anyway, our encounter is something that I never have totally been able to explain, and since he ended up taking his own life before trial, I likely never will.